The question hangs in the air, sharp and unsettling. Is a lie ever justified? It's a moral tightrope walk, demanding we consider not only the immediate situation, but also the very foundation of our ethical beliefs. Different philosophical frameworks offer vastly different perspectives, transforming the simple act of lying into a complex calculus of right and wrong. Let's start with consequentialism, the ethical theory that judges actions based on their outcomes. A consequentialist, particularly a utilitarian, might argue that a lie is justified if it maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. The classic example is the white lie told to spare someone's feelings, telling a friend you love their hideous new haircut to avoid hurting their self-esteem. The small deception brings about a greater good, or at least avoids a greater harm. A more dramatic scenario might involve lying to a tyrannical government to protect innocent people from persecution. Here, the potential for widespread suffering outweighs the inherent wrongness of the lie, at least in the consequentialist view. The dilemma, however, lies in predicting the future. Can we truly know all the consequences of our actions? A seemingly harmless lie might unravel, leading to unforeseen and devastating repercussions. Then we have deontology, an ethical framework that emphasizes duty and adherence to moral rules, regardless of the consequences. Immanuel Kant, a prominent deontologist, argued that lying is always wrong, a violation of the categorical imperative, a universal moral law that dictates we should act only according to principles that we could will to become universal laws. Imagine a world where everyone lied. Trust would crumble, communication would become impossible, and society would collapse. Therefore, lying cannot be universalized and is inherently immoral. Even in situations where lying might seem beneficial, such as protecting a friend from a murderer, a deontologist would argue that lying is never permissible. The moral duty to tell the truth supersedes any potential positive outcome. This rigid stance, however, can feel intuitively wrong. Is it really morally superior to stand on principle while innocent lives are lost? Beyond these two major frameworks, other perspectives offer nuanced approaches. Virtue ethics focuses on character rather than rules or consequences. A virtue ethicist would ask what a virtuous person would do in a given situation. Lying, in this view, will be judged based on the underlying motivation and the character traits it reflects. A lie told out of compassion might be viewed differently than a lie told out of malice. The impact of this dilemma extends far beyond philosophical debates. It influences our legal systems, our personal relationships, and our professional conduct. Consider the legal concept of perjury, where lying under oath carries serious consequences, reflecting society's commitment to truthfulness in legal proceedings. In medicine, the debate over therapeutic privilege, where doctors might withhold information from patients if they believe it would cause them significant harm, highlights the tension between the duty to be truthful and the desire to benefit the patient. Similarly, in journalism, the use of undercover reporting, which often involves deception, raises ethical questions about the pursuit of truth and the potential harm caused by lying. Ultimately, is a lie ever justified? Dilemma forces us to confront our own moral values and to consider the complexities of human interaction. There is no easy answer, and the best course of action often depends on the specific circumstances and our own deeply held beliefs. It demands careful consideration, empathy, and a willingness to grapple with the uncomfortable truths that lying, however well-intentioned, can reveal about ourselves and the world around us. The dilemma of forgiveness. It's a knot of conflicting emotions and ethical considerations, a tightrope walk over the chasm of hurt. At its heart lies the question, can, and indeed should, we forgive those who have inflicted significant harm? It's not merely about absolving someone of guilt, but about navigating the complex terrain of justice, personal healing, and the potential for future harm. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's not condoning the act, excusing the perpetrator, or necessarily reconciling with them. Instead, forgiveness is a deeply personal process, a conscious decision to release the resentment anger, and bitterness associated with the offense. It's a shift in perspective from victimhood to a position of agency, where one chooses to liberate oneself from the emotional prison built by the transgression. The ethical implications are profound. On one hand, forgiveness can be seen as a virtue, a demonstration of empathy, compassion, and a commitment to a higher moral code. Holding on to anger and resentment can be incredibly destructive, corroding one's mental and physical well-being. Forgiveness can break this cycle, fostering inner peace and promoting reconciliation, both within oneself and potentially with the offender, if appropriate and safe. It allows for the possibility of growth, learning, and even positive transformation, both for the victim and, theoretically, the perpetrator. However, forgiveness also raises serious concerns about justice and accountability. Does forgiving someone minimize the severity of their actions? Does it send the wrong message to society, implying that certain behaviors are acceptable if followed by an apology or plea for forgiveness? What about situations involving systemic injustice, where forgiveness could undermine efforts to achieve broader social change and hold powerful institutions accountable? Consider a scenario. A victim of childhood abuse struggles with the decision to forgive their abuser. Forgiving might offer a path to healing, allowing them to move past the trauma and build a more fulfilling life. However, it could also feel like betraying their younger self, minimizing the profound damage inflicted upon them, and potentially enabling the abuser to continue their harmful behavior unchecked. The ethical weight of this decision is immense. The how of forgiveness is equally complex. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Some may find solace in therapy, exploring their emotions and developing coping mechanisms. Others may find spiritual or religious practices helpful. Some may choose to confront the offender, expressing their pain and demanding accountability. Others may choose to forgive silently, without any direct interaction. The key is to prioritize one's own emotional safety and well-being, ensuring that the process of forgiveness doesn't re-traumatize or endanger them. Furthermore, forgiveness is not always possible, nor should it be forced. Some wounds are simply too deep, the betrayal too profound. Holding on to anger may be a necessary act of self-preservation, a way of maintaining boundaries and protecting oneself from further harm. The pressure to forgive, particularly from well-meaning friends or family, can be incredibly damaging, invalidating the victim's experience and hindering their healing process. Ultimately, the decision to forgive is a deeply personal and ethically fraught one. It requires careful consideration of the circumstances, the potential consequences, and, most importantly, one's own emotional needs. It's a journey, not a destination, and there is no right or wrong answer. The ethical imperative lies in making an informed and conscious choice, one that prioritizes healing and justice, without minimizing the profound impact of the harm inflicted. It's about finding a path towards a future that acknowledges the past, without being defined by it. The affirmative action dilemma sits at the razor's edge of justice and equality. It represents a conscious effort to address the lingering shadows of historical injustices, systemic discrimination against marginalized groups that has created deeply entrenched disadvantages. The core principle is simple: to proactively increase representation and opportunities for these groups in areas like education, employment, and government contracting. But the execution is anything but simple, raising thorny questions about fairness, meritocracy, and the very definition of equality. At its heart, affirmative action attempts to level a playing field that has been demonstrably tilted for centuries. Consider a hypothetical but all too real scenario. Two candidates apply for a coveted position at a tech firm. Candidate A, a white male from a privileged background, attended top-tier schools, benefited from extensive networking opportunities, and never faced systemic barriers based on his race or gender. Candidate B, a black woman from a disadvantaged background, also possesses strong qualifications, but attended a less prestigious university due to financial constraints and navigated a professional landscape riddled with implicit bias. In a purely meritocratic system, proponents argue, candidate A would likely be favored based on his pedigree and access. However, affirmative action suggests considering candidate B's application in light of the historical and ongoing disadvantages she has overcome. This doesn't necessarily mean lowering standards, but rather recognizing the value of her resilience, unique perspectives, and potential contributions to a more diverse and inclusive workplace. The mechanisms of affirmative action vary widely. Some policies involve setting quotas, which are numerical targets for the representation of specific groups. These are often considered the most controversial form, as they can be perceived as reverse discrimination. More common are preferential treatment policies, where candidates from underrepresented groups receive extra points or consideration during the evaluation process. Another approach focuses on outreach and recruitment programs designed to expand the pool of qualified candidates from diverse backgrounds. The impact of affirmative action is multifaceted and hotly debated. Studies show that it has contributed to increased representation of marginalized groups in education and employment, particularly in fields where they were historically excluded. This can lead to greater social mobility, economic empowerment, and a more diverse and representative workforce. Furthermore, diversity is increasingly recognized as a strength, fostering innovation, creativity, and a better understanding of diverse consumer markets. However, critics argue that affirmative action can lead to unintended consequences. They contend that it can stigmatize beneficiaries, creating the perception that they were hired or admitted based on their group identity rather than their individual merit. This can undermine their self-esteem and professional credibility. Moreover, some argue that affirmative action unfairly disadvantages qualified individuals from majority groups, leading to resentment and a sense of injustice. The Supreme Court has repeatedly weighed in on affirmative action, often striking down policies that it deems to be overly broad or discriminatory, emphasizing the need for narrowly tailored programs that promote diversity without resorting to rigid quotas. The recent decision ending affirmative action in college admissions highlights this ongoing legal and ethical tension. The dilemma ultimately lies in balancing the need to rectify past injustices with a commitment to equal opportunity for all individuals, regardless of their background. It requires careful consideration of the complexities of historical disadvantage, the potential pitfalls of preferential treatment, and an enduring pursuit of a truly just and equitable society. The question hangs in the air, heavy with implication. Can responding to an injustice with another injustice ever be considered morally sound? This is the core of the do two wrongs make a right dilemma, a perpetual ethical tightrope walk. It forces us to confront the deeply ingrained human instinct for retribution and examine the potential consequences of acting on that impulse. At its heart, the dilemma questions the very foundations of justice and morality. Utilitarianism, for instance, might argue that retaliatory actions are justifiable if they ultimately lead to a greater good. Imagine a scenario: a hacker group cripples a hospital's computer system, endangering patients. A counterattack by a cybersecurity team, though technically illegal and therefore a wrong, might disable the hacker's infrastructure, preventing further harm and saving lives. Here, the wrong of hacking back could be argued as morally justifiable because it prevents a far greater wrong. But this hinges on accurately predicting and controlling the consequences, a risky proposition. Deontology, with its emphasis on moral duties and rules, generally rejects the notion. A deontological perspective would likely deem retaliation inherently wrong because it violates the principle against causing harm. The act of retaliation, regardless of its potential outcome, is itself a violation of a moral rule. The focus shifts from consequence to the inherent rightness or wrongness of the action. The allure of retaliatory action stems from several psychological mechanisms. Firstly, the principle of reciprocity, the innate desire to return a favor, or in this case, an injury. This instinct is deeply rooted in our evolutionary past, fostering cooperation and discouraging exploitation within social groups. When we feel wronged, the impulse to retaliate provides a sense of regaining control and restoring balance. It's an emotional response, often bypassing rational deliberation. Secondly, there's the concept of justice sensitivity. Individuals high in justice sensitivity are acutely aware of perceived unfairness and experience intense emotional reactions to it. This heightened awareness can lead to a stronger urge to punish those who have wronged them, even if the punishment involves engaging in questionable behavior. They might feel morally obligated to right the wrong, even if it requires them to commit another. However, the inherent danger lies in the potential for escalation. Retaliatory actions often trigger a cycle of revenge, where each wrong begets another, leading to a spiral of increasing violence and injustice. Consider historical conflicts fueled by cycles of retribution. Each act of aggression is justified by a previous perceived wrong, perpetuating the conflict indefinitely. The initial moral high ground, if there ever was one, quickly erodes as both sides engage in increasingly reprehensible behavior. Moreover, even when intended to restore justice, retaliatory actions can be disproportionate or misdirected, harming innocent individuals. A classic example is collateral damage in warfare, where civilian casualties are an unintended but often inevitable consequence of military action. While the initial action might be framed as a justifiable response to aggression, the resulting harm to non-combatants raises serious ethical questions about the true cost of retaliation. Ultimately, the do two wrongs make a right dilemma highlights the complexities of moral decision-making. There are rarely easy answers, and each situation demands careful consideration of the potential consequences, the underlying principles at stake, and the potential for escalation. While the instinct for retribution is powerful, it must be tempered by reason, empathy, and a commitment to breaking the cycle of violence. The pursuit of justice, ideally, should aim for restoration and reconciliation, not merely the perpetuation of harm. The problem of dirty hands. A chillingly pragmatic concept that stares directly into the abyss of moral compromise. It forces us to confront the unsettling reality that sometimes achieving a greater good may necessitate actions that are, in themselves, morally questionable. The hands that strive to build a better world may inevitably become stained in the process. At its core, the problem of dirty hands highlights the conflict between adhering to strict moral principles and the perceived need to achieve a beneficial outcome, especially in situations with high stakes and limited options. It suggests that those in positions of power or responsibility may be compelled to engage in actions that violate their own moral code, actions they would otherwise condemn, believing that these actions will ultimately serve a larger, more important purpose. Think of a politician who needs to secure funding for a vital healthcare program. They might be forced to make a deal with a corporation known for unethical environmental practices, promising them tax breaks or regulatory loopholes in exchange for their financial support. The politician knows that this deal is morally problematic, potentially harming the environment and future generations. However, they argue that the healthcare program will save countless lives and alleviate suffering, justifying the compromise as the lesser of two evils. The mechanism at play involves a specific type of consequentialism, a moral philosophy emphasizing the consequences of actions as the primary determinant of their rightness or wrongness. However, the problem of dirty hands adds a crucial layer. It acknowledges the inherent wrongness of the action itself, even if its consequences are deemed positive overall. The moral agent, the person performing the action, is not absolved of moral responsibility simply because they believe their actions are for the greater good. They are still accountable for the harm they inflict, the principles they violate, and the potential erosion of moral standards that their actions might trigger. The impact of engaging in dirty hands actions is profound and multifaceted. Firstly, there is the immediate moral cost. The agent experiences guilt, shame, and cognitive dissonance. They may struggle to reconcile their actions with their values, leading to psychological distress and a loss of moral integrity. Secondly, there are broader societal consequences. When leaders and institutions engage in morally questionable actions, even with good intentions, it can erode public trust, foster cynicism, and normalize unethical behavior. If compromising principles becomes commonplace, it can create a slippery slope, leading to a gradual decline in moral standards and a weakening of the social fabric. Consider the hypothetical scenario of a police chief who knows that a terrorist attack is imminent. They also know that they can prevent the attack by torturing a captured suspect who possesses vital information. Torture is unequivocally wrong, a violation of human rights, and a degradation of moral values. Yet, the police chief might argue that the potential loss of life justifies the use of torture in this specific instance. Even if they succeed in preventing the attack, they will have crossed a significant moral boundary, setting a dangerous precedent and potentially traumatizing both the victim and themselves. The clean solution, adhering to moral principles, would result in catastrophic loss of life. The dirty solution, torture, could save lives but tarnish the moral fiber of society and the individual. The justification often relies on an appeal to necessity, arguing that the circumstances leave no other viable option. However, this justification can be easily abused. The line between genuine necessity and self-serving rationalization can be blurred. Determining whether an action truly qualifies as a dirty hands situation requiring a compromise for the greater good, or whether it is simply an excuse for unethical behavior, requires careful consideration, transparency, and accountability. The moral cost of dirty hands is real, regardless of the outcome, and must be acknowledged and addressed to prevent the erosion of ethical standards. The bystander effect dilemma plunges us into a chilling reality. The more people present during an emergency, the less likely any single individual is to intervene. It's a counterintuitive phenomenon, a stark deviation from our expectations of collective responsibility. At its heart lies the ethical obligation to help someone in need, pitted against the diffusion of responsibility, a psychological quirk that can have devastating consequences. The core of the dilemma rests on this diffusion. When we are alone with someone needing help, the responsibility falls squarely on our shoulders. We are the only ones who can act. But introduce other potential helpers, and that sense of personal responsibility begins to dilute, spreading thin across the group. The thought process becomes, often unconsciously, someone else will help. I don't need to get involved. This isn't necessarily about callousness or indifference, but rather a miscalculation of our own personal obligation, fostered by the presence of others. This diffusion is amplified by two other key factors: pluralistic ignorance and evaluation apprehension. Pluralistic ignorance occurs when individuals in a group privately believe one thing, but assume that most others believe the opposite. In an emergency situation, this translates to everyone observing the situation, noticing that no one else is reacting, and then concluding that the situation isn't actually an emergency. They are ignorant of the fact that everyone else is also hesitant, likely for the same reason. No one wants to be the one to overreact, to misinterpret a situation and look foolish. Evaluation apprehension, on the other hand, is the fear of being judged negatively by others. Potential bystanders might worry about making a mistake, not knowing how to properly assist, or even making the situation worse. This fear of social disapproval can be paralyzing, preventing them from acting, even if they genuinely want to help. The possibility of appearing incompetent or interfering unnecessarily outweighs the perceived need to intervene. Imagine a scenario. A woman collapses on a busy city street. Dozens of people walk by. Logically, one would assume that with so many witnesses, help would arrive swiftly. However, the bystander effect predicts precisely the opposite. Each passerby sees the others, assumes someone else will call for an ambulance, and continues on their way. The responsibility is diluted, the fear of social judgment looms, and the woman lies unattended for a crucial period. This isn't merely a theoretical construct. The infamous case of Kitty Genovese, murdered in 1964, while dozens of neighbors reportedly watched or heard the attack without intervening, brought the bystander effect into sharp focus and sparked intensive research into this phenomenon. While the details of the Genovese case have been debated and nuanced over time, its impact on our understanding of social psychology remains profound. It highlighted the dark side of urban anonymity and the terrifying potential for collective inaction. Overcoming the bystander effect requires conscious effort and a willingness to disrupt the status quo. Recognizing the phenomenon itself is the first step. Individuals need to understand that in a group setting, the assumption that someone else will help is often flawed and dangerous. Actively choosing to intervene, even in a small way, calling for help, asking if someone needs assistance, or simply acknowledging the situation, can break the cycle of inaction. Ultimately, the ethical obligation to help someone in need transcends the comfort of conformity and the fear of judgment. It demands a personal commitment to acting responsibly, even when surrounded by others who are not. Recognizing the bystander effect, understanding its mechanisms, and consciously choosing to overcome it is not just a matter of social responsibility, but a fundamental aspect of our shared humanity. It is a constant reminder that inaction, in the face of suffering, is a choice, and one with potentially dire consequences. The question of animal rights is a moral battleground, a clash between fundamentally different worldviews that dictate our treatment of non-human life. At its heart lies the tension between anthropocentrism and biocentrism, two opposing philosophies that shape our ethical compass when it comes to animals. Anthropocentrism, literally human-centeredness, places humans at the apex of moral consideration. It asserts that human interests are paramount and that the value of anything else, including animals, is determined by its usefulness to us. Under this lens, animals possess instrumental value only. They are tools, resources, or commodities to be used for our benefit, for food, labor, scientific research, or even entertainment. The justification often rests on claims of human exceptionalism. Our superior intelligence, our capacity for reason, our possession of language, or our ability to create culture. Because we possess these traits, and animals ostensibly do not, at least not to the same degree, we are granted a privileged moral status, allowing us to exploit them for our gain. Consider factory farming, a stark illustration of anthropocentrism in action. Animals are confined to small spaces, denied natural behaviors, and slaughtered at young ages, all in the name of maximizing efficiency and profit to feed human populations. The suffering inflicted is often immense, yet it's justified by the anthropocentric argument that human needs outweigh the animal's right to a decent life, or even simply to exist. Similarly, animal testing, while often aimed at developing life-saving drugs for humans, involves inflicting pain and distress on animals. Again, the benefit to humans is used to legitimize actions that would be considered morally reprehensible if inflicted upon another human being. The core assumption is that human lives are inherently more valuable. Biocentrism, in stark contrast, ascribes intrinsic value to all living beings. It asserts that all life, regardless of complexity or usefulness to humans, has inherent worth and deserves moral consideration. This doesn't necessarily equate all life forms, say, a bacterium and a chimpanzee, but it does mean that each possesses a right to exist and flourish, limited perhaps by the rights of other living things. Biocentrism challenges the notion of human supremacy, arguing that our intelligence and cultural achievements do not automatically grant us the right to dominate and exploit other species. A biocentric perspective views factory farming as inherently unethical. The sheer scale of suffering, the denial of natural behaviors, and the commodification of living beings are seen as violations of animals' inherent rights. Instead of viewing animals as resources, biocentrism advocates for a more compassionate and respectful relationship, one that minimizes harm and maximizes well-being. Similarly, animal testing is viewed with extreme skepticism, if not outright opposition. The benefits to humans are not seen as automatically justifying the infliction of suffering on sentient beings. Alternative methods, such as in vitro testing and computer modeling, are actively promoted as more ethical and sustainable approaches. The implications of adopting a biocentric perspective are profound. It requires a fundamental reevaluation of our relationship with the natural world, demanding a shift away from exploitation and towards coexistence. It forces us to question our dietary choices, our consumer habits, and our research practices, demanding that we consider the impact of our actions on all living things. The debate between anthropocentrism and biocentrism highlights the complexity of moral decision-making. There isn't always a clear-cut answer, and finding a balance between human needs and animal welfare is often a difficult and nuanced process. However, by acknowledging the inherent value of all life, we can begin to develop a more ethical and sustainable approach to our treatment of animals, one that reflects our shared responsibility for the well-being of the planet and all its inhabitants. This ongoing conversation prompts us to consider not just what we can do, but what we should do. The free speech dilemma is a tightrope walk across a chasm of conflicting values. The fundamental right to express oneself freely versus the pressing need to protect individuals and society from the potential harm caused by hateful or inflammatory speech. At its core lies a tension between two powerful forces: the autonomy of the individual to voice their thoughts and beliefs, regardless of how unpopular or offensive, and the collective responsibility to ensure safety, equality, and social cohesion. The mechanism at play here is complex. Free speech, ideally, allows for the open exchange of ideas, fostering intellectual growth, challenging the status quo, and enabling informed decision-making. John Stuart Mill, in his seminal work on liberty, argued that even false or offensive opinions should be tolerated, as their suppression stifles the discovery of truth. He posited that the collision of ideas, even unpleasant ones, is vital for progress. However, this idealized vision clashes with the reality of hate speech, which aims to demean, marginalize, and incite violence against specific groups based on characteristics like race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. The harm caused by such speech can be profound. It can lead to emotional distress, psychological trauma, discrimination, and, in extreme cases, physical violence. The impact extends beyond the immediate victims, creating a climate of fear and intolerance that undermines social stability. Consider the hypothetical scenario of a social media platform grappling with a surge of posts targeting a specific ethnic minority, filled with derogatory language and conspiracy theories. Allowing these posts to remain online under the banner of free speech could embolden perpetrators, normalize prejudice, and contribute to real-world acts of discrimination and violence. Conversely, censoring these posts could be seen as an infringement on the freedom of expression and potentially lead to accusations of bias or political censorship. The challenge lies in drawing a line between protected speech and harmful speech. Various legal frameworks and ethical considerations attempt to address this challenge, often employing concepts like incitement to violence, fighting words, or defamation. The incitement to violence standard, for example, typically requires that speech be directly and intentionally aimed at inciting imminent lawless action and is likely to produce such action. This is a high bar designed to protect even unpopular or offensive opinions that do not pose an immediate threat. However, the application of these standards is often fraught with difficulty. The line between expressing an opinion and inciting hatred can be blurry, especially in the digital age, where speech can spread rapidly and virally. Furthermore, the definition of harm is itself subject to interpretation and can vary across cultures and legal systems. What constitutes hate speech in one country may be considered protected speech in another. The impact of this dilemma is far-reaching. It shapes public discourse, influences social attitudes, and affects the lives of countless individuals. Navigating this complex landscape requires careful consideration of competing values, a nuanced understanding of the potential harms of speech, and a commitment to protecting both freedom of expression and the safety and well-being of all members of society. Failure to do so risks either stifling intellectual discourse or allowing hate and prejudice to flourish. It demands constant vigilance and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations about the limits of tolerance and the responsibilities that accompany freedom. The conflict of interest dilemma, a tightrope walk between personal desire and professional obligation. At its core, it represents a situation where an individual's private interests, financial, familial, social, or even reputational, stand to influence or appear to influence their professional decisions and actions. It's a fundamental battle between me and we, between the immediate gratification of personal gain and the long-term integrity of a professional role. The mechanism at play is deceptively simple, yet incredibly powerful. Our brains are wired to prioritize our own well-being and that of our close network. This inherent self-interest acts as a constant undercurrent, subtly shaping our perceptions and motivations. When personal interests align with professional responsibilities, there's no dilemma. However, when they diverge, that undercurrent becomes a strong, potentially destructive force. Consider a hypothetical, yet common, scenario. A project manager tasked with selecting a vendor for a crucial IT infrastructure upgrade. Unbeknownst to their employer, the project manager's sibling owns a small IT company that could bid for the contract. Even if the sibling's company isn't the best choice, the project manager might subconsciously or even consciously favor their sibling's bid, rationalizing it with justifications like they're a good company or they deserve a chance. This favoritism, even if subtle, undermines the fair bidding process and potentially leads to a suboptimal outcome for the project and ultimately the employer. The impact of conflict of interest dilemmas can be far-reaching. They erode trust, not only between individuals, but also within entire organizations and even across industries. When stakeholders perceive that decisions are being made based on personal gain rather than objective merit, confidence plummets. This can lead to decreased productivity, reputational damage, legal challenges, and even financial ruin. The 2008 financial crisis, in part, was fueled by conflicts of interest within the credit rating agencies, where ratings were swayed by the desire to maintain lucrative relationships with the very companies they were supposed to objectively evaluate. These dilemmas often operate in a gray area, making them particularly challenging to navigate. It's not always a matter of blatant corruption or intentional wrongdoing. Sometimes, the conflict is unintentional, a consequence of unconscious bias or a lack of awareness. For example, a doctor prescribing a medication heavily promoted by a pharmaceutical company, unaware of how the promotional materials have subtly influenced their judgment. Managing conflict of interest requires a multifaceted approach. Transparency is paramount. Disclosing potential conflicts, even perceived ones, allows for oversight and mitigation. This doesn't necessarily mean recusing oneself from a situation, but rather ensuring that decisions are made with awareness and accountability. Organizations should implement robust conflict of interest policies that clearly define unacceptable behaviors and provide mechanisms for reporting and resolving conflicts. These policies must be actively enforced and regularly reviewed to remain effective. Beyond policies, cultivating a culture of ethical awareness is crucial. This involves training employees to recognize potential conflicts, understand the ethical implications, and develop the skills to navigate these situations responsibly. Promoting critical thinking and objective analysis can help to mitigate the influence of unconscious biases. Furthermore, fostering a culture of open communication and psychological safety encourages individuals to speak up when they perceive a conflict without fear of reprisal. Ultimately, resolving conflict of interest dilemmas requires a commitment to integrity and a willingness to prioritize professional duty over personal gain, even when it's difficult. It demands self-awareness, ethical reasoning, and a courage to challenge one's own biases and assumptions. The cost of inaction is simply too high. The erosion of trust, the degradation of professional standards, and the potential for significant harm. The environmental conservation dilemma sits squarely at the intersection of human ambition and planetary survival. It boils down to this agonizing question: how do we reconcile our seemingly insatiable desire for economic progress with the undeniable need to safeguard the natural world that sustains us? It's a constant tug-of-war, a balancing act performed on a tightrope strung between immediate gratification and long-term well-being. At its heart, the dilemma arises from the perceived, and often very real, conflict between activities that generate wealth and jobs. Resource extraction, industrial manufacturing, large-scale agriculture, and the preservation of ecosystems, biodiversity, and clean air and water. Economic development frequently necessitates the exploitation of natural resources, whether it's logging forests for timber, mining for minerals, damming rivers for hydroelectric power, or clearing land for agriculture or urban expansion. Each of these activities, while potentially boosting economic output, carries a significant environmental cost. The mechanism at play is often one of deferred consequences and dispersed responsibility. The immediate benefits of economic activity are concentrated and readily apparent. Jobs created, profits earned, goods produced. The environmental costs, however, are often diffuse, delayed, and difficult to quantify. For instance, a logging company benefits directly from selling timber, and the local community may benefit from the jobs created. But the deforestation contributes to habitat loss, soil erosion, reduced carbon sequestration, and potentially climate change. Consequences that affect not just the local area, but the entire planet, and not just the present generation, but future ones. This temporal and spatial disconnect makes it politically and psychologically challenging to prioritize environmental protection over economic gain. Consider the example of a developing nation rich in mineral resources. The discovery of a large deposit of copper, for example, could offer a pathway out of poverty for many citizens. Mining the copper, however, involves clearing forests, disrupting ecosystems, generating pollution, and potentially displacing communities. The government faces a difficult choice: prioritize the potential economic benefits, accepting the environmental costs, or restrict mining activities to protect the environment, potentially foregoing significant economic opportunities. The pressure to choose economic development is often immense, especially when international financial institutions condition loans on resource exploitation or when neighboring countries are already reaping the rewards of similar activities. Or picture a small coastal community heavily reliant on fishing. Overfishing, driven by the desire for higher catches and greater profits, threatens to deplete fish stocks and damage the marine ecosystem. Implementing fishing quotas and other conservation measures would protect the long-term health of the ecosystem and ensure sustainable fishing for future generations. However, it would also reduce the immediate income of fishermen and potentially lead to job losses. The community faces a choice between short-term economic hardship and long-term ecological stability. The impact of this dilemma is far-reaching. Unsustainable resource extraction leads to deforestation, desertification, and the loss of biodiversity. Pollution from industrial activities contaminates air and water, harming human health and ecosystems. Climate change, driven by greenhouse gas emissions from economic activities, threatens to disrupt global weather patterns, sea levels, and agricultural productivity. The consequences are particularly severe for vulnerable populations who are disproportionately affected by environmental degradation and lack the resources to adapt. Ultimately, resolving the environmental conservation dilemma requires a fundamental shift in mindset. We need to move beyond the false dichotomy of economy versus environment and recognize that a healthy environment is not an impediment to economic prosperity, but rather a prerequisite for it. Sustainable development, which seeks to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, offers a potential pathway forward. This requires integrating environmental considerations into all aspects of economic decision-making, investing in green technologies, promoting sustainable consumption patterns, and fostering a greater sense of environmental stewardship. It also necessitates international cooperation and a willingness to share the costs and benefits of environmental protection equitably. The challenge is enormous, but the stakes are even higher. The future of our planet and the well-being of humanity depends on our ability to navigate this complex moral terrain. The poverty relief dilemma. It's a tightrope walk between offering a hand up and inadvertently creating a cycle of dependence. At its heart lies a fundamental tension. How do we provide immediate relief to those in need without undermining their long-term capacity to provide for themselves? The core concept hinges on understanding that poverty is rarely just about a lack of resources. It's often intertwined with a complex web of factors, including lack of access to education, healthcare, credit, and stable employment, as well as societal and political marginalization. Simply providing cash or goods, while addressing immediate hunger or hardship, might not tackle these underlying causes. It can even disincentivize self-reliance, particularly if aid is perceived as a guaranteed, unconditional entitlement. Imagine a hypothetical village ravaged by drought. An international aid organization rushes in, providing food rations and water. Initially, this is a lifesaver, preventing starvation and disease. However, if this aid continues indefinitely without any accompanying programs to help the villagers adapt to the changing climate, learn new farming techniques, or diversify their income sources, it can create a dependency trap. Villagers may abandon their traditional farming practices, lose crucial skills, and become reliant on external assistance. They may even be less motivated to seek out alternative solutions, knowing that aid will always be available. The mechanism behind this dependency is multifaceted. Firstly, the aid can crowd out local markets and industries. If food is distributed for free, local farmers might struggle to sell their produce, further weakening the village's economy. Secondly, it can undermine local governance and accountability. If aid is channeled directly to individuals or communities without involving local authorities, it can weaken their legitimacy and capacity to respond to the needs of their constituents. Finally, and perhaps most subtly, it can erode people's sense of agency and self-efficacy. If individuals believe they are powerless to change their circumstances and that their well-being depends solely on external assistance, they're less likely to invest in their own future. Empowerment-focused aid programs, on the other hand, aim to break this cycle by focusing on building long-term capacity. These programs prioritize education, skills training, microfinance, and access to healthcare. They emphasize participation and ownership, ensuring that beneficiaries are actively involved in designing and implementing the solutions that affect their lives. A real-world example is the Grameen Bank, founded by Muhammad Yunus, which provides small loans to impoverished individuals, primarily women, to start their own businesses. This empowers them to become self-sufficient and contribute to their communities. Another example is conditional cash transfer programs, where aid is provided on the condition that beneficiaries meet certain requirements, such as sending their children to school or attending health checkups. This incentivizes investment in human capital and promotes long-term development. The impact of empowerment-focused aid is significantly more sustainable. It creates a ripple effect, as individuals who are empowered to improve their own lives are also more likely to invest in their children's education, participate in local governance, and contribute to the overall development of their communities. They become agents of change rather than passive recipients of aid. However, designing effective empowerment programs is not easy. It requires a deep understanding of the local context, a commitment to participatory approaches, and a willingness to invest in long-term capacity building. It also requires careful monitoring and evaluation to ensure that programs are achieving their intended outcomes and not inadvertently creating unintended consequences. It's a nuanced, complex challenge, but one that's absolutely crucial if we are to truly alleviate poverty and create a more just and equitable world. The moral imperative demands not just alleviating suffering, but fostering self-reliance. The truth versus loyalty dilemma, a battle fought within the chambers of our conscience. At its core, it presents us with a stark choice: uphold honesty, the pillar of trust and transparency, or pledge allegiance, the bedrock of relationships and belonging. It's a treacherous landscape where the path forward isn't paved with good intentions, but riddled with potential consequences that ripple outwards, impacting not only ourselves, but those we hold dear. This dilemma arises whenever the truth, in its raw, unvarnished form, directly conflicts with our duty, perceived or real, to remain loyal to a friend, family member, or even a group. It's not simply about withholding information. It's about actively choosing what to reveal and to whom, knowing that either course of action will inflict some form of damage. The mechanism behind this internal conflict is deeply rooted in our social nature. Humans are wired for connection, for belonging. Loyalty, therefore, becomes a currency, a demonstration of our commitment to these vital bonds. Conversely, truth-telling is often framed as a universal good, a moral imperative that underpins justice and fairness. When these two powerful forces collide, the resulting tension can be excruciating. Consider a hypothetical scenario. Imagine your best friend confided in you about cheating on their partner. You are now privy to a truth that, if revealed, would shatter their relationship and betray their trust in you. Remaining loyal means keeping their secret, effectively condoning their actions, and potentially enabling further deception. Speaking the truth, perhaps by anonymously informing their partner or urging your friend to confess, would uphold honesty and potentially prevent further harm, but would undoubtedly sever the bond between you and your friend. The weight of this decision rests on your shoulders, amplified by the knowledge that either choice carries significant repercussions. The impact of this dilemma extends far beyond the immediate situation. Choosing loyalty over truth can erode your own integrity. It can lead to feelings of guilt, anxiety, and a gradual erosion of your self-respect. You might begin to question your own moral compass, wondering if you've compromised your values for the sake of maintaining a relationship. Conversely, choosing truth over loyalty can brand you as a betrayer, a pariah within your social circle. You might face ostracization, judgment, and the painful realization that you've prioritized principle over personal connection. Real-world examples abound. Whistleblowing, often lauded as an act of courage, frequently forces individuals to choose between loyalty to their employer and their obligation to expose wrongdoing. A doctor discovering a colleague's malpractice faces a similar crisis. Reporting the truth could save lives, but would violate the unspoken code of silence within the medical profession. Even within families, this dilemma manifests in subtle, yet profound ways. A child overhearing their parents arguing about financial difficulties might choose to remain silent, protecting their younger siblings from worry, but at the expense of fostering open communication. Navigating this ethical tightrope requires careful consideration of several factors. What are the potential consequences of each choice? Who will be affected? And to what extent? What are your own deeply held values? And which one takes precedence in this particular situation? Is there a way to mitigate the harm, perhaps by encouraging the person to come clean themselves or by seeking guidance from a trusted third party? There's no easy answer, no universal solution. Each instance demands a nuanced assessment, a painful weighing of competing moral obligations, and a willingness to accept the inevitable fallout, regardless of the path chosen. The truth versus loyalty dilemma serves as a constant reminder of the complexities inherent in human relationships and the enduring challenge of navigating the treacherous waters of morality. The weight of a promise. It's a cornerstone of social interaction, a thread in the fabric of trust that binds us together. But what happens when that thread starts to fray? When fulfilling a promise, initially made in good faith, becomes ethically problematic, even harmful. We delve now into the murky waters of the promise-keeping dilemma. When, if ever, is it permissible to break a promise? At its core, the dilemma hinges on the conflict between the inherent moral obligation to uphold agreements and the potential consequences of doing so. Deontological ethics, championed by philosophers like Immanuel Kant, would argue that promises, like lying, are inherently wrong to break. Duty dictates that we adhere to our commitments, regardless of the outcome. But reality is rarely so black and white. Consider a hypothetical scenario. You promise a friend, struggling financially, that you'll invest a significant portion of your savings in their new business venture. Months later, due to unforeseen circumstances, perhaps a sudden family illness requiring expensive treatment, your own financial security is threatened. Keeping your promise would jeopardize your ability to provide for your family's essential needs. Are you obligated to honor the initial commitment, potentially sacrificing your family's well-being? This scenario highlights several factors that often justify reneging on a commitment. First, the magnitude of harm. If fulfilling the promise would result in significantly greater harm to yourself or others than the harm caused by breaking it, the ethical calculus shifts. The principle of least harm suggests choosing the course of action that minimizes overall suffering. Second, changed circumstances play a crucial role. The original promise was likely made based on certain assumptions about the future. If those assumptions prove to be false due to unforeseen events, the moral landscape changes. A promise made under one set of conditions may not be ethically binding when those conditions drastically alter. This isn't a blanket excuse, however. The changes must be significant and unforeseen, not merely inconveniences. Third, the nature of the promise itself matters. Was it a casual, informal agreement, or a legally binding contract? Was it a promise that carried significant weight and implied a high level of commitment? The more formal and significant the promise, the stronger the moral obligation to uphold it. Another justifying factor involves promises made under duress or based on misinformation. Imagine being coerced into promising something against your will, or unknowingly promising something based on false information provided by another party. In these cases, the promise may not be considered morally binding due to the lack of genuine consent or informed judgment. Furthermore, consider the concept of competing promises. What if you've made conflicting promises to different parties, where fulfilling one necessitates breaking the other? Choosing which promise to uphold becomes a complex ethical judgment, often requiring prioritization based on factors like the severity of the potential harm to each party, the nature of the relationship, and the original intent behind each promise. The impact of breaking a promise can be profound. It damages trust, erodes relationships, and can have significant legal and financial consequences. Therefore, the decision to renege should never be taken lightly. It demands careful consideration of all relevant factors, a sincere effort to mitigate the harm caused by breaking the promise, and open and honest communication with all affected parties. Explaining the rationale behind the decision, offering apologies, and exploring alternative solutions can help preserve relationships and minimize the negative impact. Even when ethically justified, breaking a promise leaves a mark. The question isn't about finding easy outs, but about navigating the complex terrain of human relationships with integrity and a commitment to minimizing harm in a world where unforeseen circumstances can force us to confront impossible choices. Distributive justice cuts to the very quick of fairness. It grapples with how societies should allocate resources, be it wealth, opportunities, or even burdens, amongst its members. It's the philosophical wrestling match over who gets what and why. The core question is breathtakingly simple, yet agonizingly complex. How do we distribute the pie of societal benefits and burdens fairly? Three dominant theories rise to the fore in this debate: egalitarianism, utilitarianism, and libertarianism. Each offers a radically different roadmap to navigate this moral minefield. Egalitarianism, at its heart, champions equality. It proposes that resources should be distributed equally, or at least that any inequalities must be justified. The ideal, often simplified, is that everyone receives the same slice of the pie. This isn't always about absolute sameness. Some egalitarians advocate for equality of opportunity, ensuring everyone starts from the same baseline, even if outcomes differ. Imagine a society where every child receives the same quality of education, healthcare, and nutritional support, regardless of their background. This strives for equality of opportunity. However, strict equality of outcome. Everyone earning precisely the same income, for instance, faces practical challenges. It might stifle innovation and individual drive as the link between effort and reward weakens. The crucial question for egalitarians is what constitutes justified inequality. Are differences in compensation acceptable if they incentivize essential work, like doctors serving in underserved communities? The egalitarian perspective forces us to confront inherent biases and systemic disadvantages that prevent true equality. Utilitarianism, in contrast, prioritizes maximizing overall happiness and well-being. It argues that the fairest distribution is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Imagine a scenario. A government has resources to either fund a life-saving treatment for a small group of critically ill patients or to implement a widespread preventative healthcare program that benefits a much larger population, albeit with smaller individual gains. A utilitarian would likely favor the latter, even if it means some critically ill patients miss out on a chance to survive. This is because the overall happiness, the total well-being across the population, is believed to be higher. Utilitarianism relies heavily on cost-benefit analyses and predictive modeling, attempting to quantify happiness and suffering. However, this approach can lead to ethically troubling outcomes. It risks sacrificing the well-being of minorities or vulnerable groups if doing so benefits the majority. Imagine a hypothetical scenario where slavery is deemed beneficial to the economy of a nation, thereby increasing overall wealth and potentially happiness for the majority. A strict utilitarian calculation might, horrifyingly, justify slavery. Therefore, many utilitarians include safeguards like rights-based constraints to protect against such egregious outcomes. Libertarianism focuses on individual rights and liberties, particularly property rights and freedom of choice. It argues that a just distribution arises from voluntary transactions and fair acquisition, regardless of the resulting inequalities. The role of the state should be limited to protecting individual rights and enforcing contracts. It shouldn't interfere with the distribution of wealth or resources. Think of a free market economy where individuals are free to accumulate wealth through hard work, investment, and innovation. A libertarian would argue that any attempt to redistribute this wealth, even to help the less fortunate, is an infringement on individual rights. According to this view, as long as the wealth was acquired fairly, without coercion, theft, or fraud, the resulting distribution is just, even if it's dramatically unequal. A famous thought experiment to illustrate this is the Wilt Chamberlain argument. If everyone voluntarily pays to watch Wilt Chamberlain play basketball, resulting in him becoming exceptionally wealthy, is that unjust? Libertarians say no, as it arose from voluntary transactions. The key challenge for libertarianism lies in addressing historical injustices and systemic inequalities that prevent genuine equality of opportunity. If some individuals start with significant disadvantages due to past discrimination or unequal access to resources, then a purely laissez-faire approach may perpetuate and even exacerbate existing inequalities. Each of these theories presents compelling arguments, yet none is without its limitations. The debate over distributive justice remains ongoing, forcing us to constantly reevaluate our notions of fairness, equality, and the role of the state in shaping a just society. Ultimately, the best approach is often a complex blend of these principles, tailored to the specific context and values of a given society. The cultural relativism dilemma throws us headfirst into a swirling vortex of perspectives, challenging our ingrained assumptions about right and wrong. At its core, cultural relativism asserts that morality is relative to the norms of one's culture. This means there are no universal moral standards that apply to all people at all times. What is considered ethical in one society may be abhorrent in another, and vice versa. The dilemma arises when we are confronted with practices that conflict with our own deeply held beliefs. How do we judge such practices? Can we judge them at all? Imagine a hypothetical society where arranged marriages are the norm, and young women are expected to enter into these unions with little or no say. From a Western perspective, steeped in the values of individual autonomy and freedom of choice, this practice might seem oppressive and unjust. We might instinctively condemn it as a violation of fundamental human rights. However, a cultural relativist would argue that to judge this practice solely from our cultural standpoint is inherently flawed. We must understand the practice within its specific cultural context. Perhaps these arranged marriages are vital for social stability, economic security, or the preservation of cultural traditions. Perhaps the women involved find fulfillment and happiness within these arrangements, even if their experience differs significantly from our own expectations. The challenge, then, is to avoid ethnocentrism, the tendency to view our own culture as superior and to judge other cultures based on its standards. Cultural relativism encourages us to adopt a more empathetic and open-minded approach, seeking to understand the reasoning and values that underpin different cultural practices. However, this doesn't mean we should blindly accept everything. A critical question that emerges is, are there any universal moral boundaries that should not be crossed, regardless of cultural context? What about practices like female genital mutilation, child marriage, or systemic discrimination against minority groups? Can we simply excuse these as cultural differences and abstain from judgment? Many argue that certain fundamental human rights, such as the right to life, freedom from torture, and freedom from slavery, should be considered universal and inviolable. These rights, enshrined in international law, provide a framework for evaluating cultural practices, even when those practices are deeply embedded in tradition. The impact of the cultural relativism dilemma is far-reaching. It affects our understanding of international relations, human rights, and social justice. It influences our approach to cross-cultural communication and our ability to engage with diverse perspectives. Navigating this dilemma requires a delicate balancing act between respecting cultural diversity and upholding fundamental moral principles. It demands critical thinking, empathy, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions. We must strive to understand the context of cultural practices, while also maintaining a commitment to universal human rights. The key lies in engaging in thoughtful dialogue, promoting cross-cultural understanding, and advocating for ethical practices that respect both cultural diversity and fundamental human dignity. To shy away from this challenge is to risk perpetuating injustice, either through blind acceptance or through the imposition of our own cultural biases on others. The moral luck dilemma throws a wrench into our neat and tidy ideas about moral responsibility. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that luck, sheer happenstance, can profoundly impact how we judge someone's actions, even when their intentions are the same. At its heart, the dilemma asks, how much should we blame or praise someone based on the outcome of their actions, when that outcome is at least partially determined by factors beyond their control? Imagine two drivers, both equally reckless, speeding down a busy street after having a few drinks. They both make the same terrible decision to drive impaired. Driver A, through sheer dumb luck, makes it home safely. Driver B, however, tragically hits a pedestrian, causing serious injury or even death. Are they equally culpable? Intuitively, we recoil at the idea. Driver B will face criminal charges, social condemnation, and a lifetime of guilt. Driver A, while still morally reprehensible, will likely escape largely unscathed. But why? They both acted with the same degree of recklessness and disregard for human life. The only difference is the outcome, which was determined by chance, whether a pedestrian happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the essence of moral luck. It arises because our moral judgments often depend not only on what people intend and do, but also on the consequences that flow from their actions. We praise the surgeon who successfully removes a tumor and saves a life, even if their skill wasn't significantly different from another surgeon whose patient dies due to unforeseen complications. We condemn the drunk driver who kills someone, even if their blood alcohol level was the same as another driver who arrived home safely. Philosophers have identified different types of moral luck. There's resultant luck, exemplified by the drunk driving scenario, where the outcome of an action differs due to chance. There's also circumstantial luck, where the moral challenges we face are determined by circumstances beyond our control. Imagine two individuals, both with the potential to be corrupt. One is placed in a position of power with access to vast sums of money, while the other remains in a low-level job with little opportunity for graft. The first individual succumbs to temptation and becomes deeply corrupt, while the second remains honest simply because they never face the same level of temptation. Is the first person morally worse, even though their character might be no different from the second? Then there's constitutive luck, which refers to the kind of person we are, our temperament, predispositions, and inherent character traits, which are largely determined by genetics and upbringing, factors over which we have no control. If someone is naturally empathetic and compassionate, are they more morally praiseworthy than someone who struggles with empathy due to their inherent nature? The impact of moral luck is profound. It challenges our belief in a just world where people get what they deserve. It makes us question the fairness of holding individuals fully accountable for consequences that are, in part, attributable to chance. It raises thorny questions about criminal justice, personal responsibility, and the very nature of moral evaluation. Acknowledging the role of moral luck doesn't mean absolving people of responsibility altogether. It means recognizing the limitations of our judgments and the influence of factors beyond individual control. It encourages a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of human behavior, prompting us to focus not just on outcomes, but also on intentions, character, and the circumstances in which people act. It necessitates a reevaluation of our systems of reward and punishment, urging us to consider how we can create a more equitable and just society in a world where luck plays such a significant role. Ignoring moral luck risks perpetuating unfair judgments and overlooking the complex interplay between individual agency and external forces that shape our lives and determine our moral fates. The slippery slope argument, a rhetorical device, a persuasive technique, and a logical fallacy all rolled into one deceptively appealing package. At its core, it's the claim that a seemingly harmless initial action will inevitably trigger a cascade of increasingly negative consequences, ultimately culminating in a disastrous outcome. It's the justification for prohibitions built on the quicksand of speculation, a projection of fear masquerading as reason. The mechanism is simple. A is allowed, therefore B will happen. B is bad, therefore A must be prevented. The supposed causal chain connecting A to the disastrous outcome, however, is often weak, unsubstantiated, or relies on conjecture rather than solid evidence. The allure of the slippery slope lies in its appeal to our innate desire to avoid negative outcomes. By framing the initial action as the first step on a perilous path, it bypasses rational consideration of its merits and jumps directly to the projected horrors at the bottom. Consider the classic example. If we legalize marijuana, then people will start using harder drugs, and eventually everyone will be addicted to heroin. The initial action, legalizing marijuana, is presented as the catalyst for a sequence of events leading to widespread heroin addiction. However, this argument relies on a series of unproven assumptions. Does legalizing marijuana inevitably lead to the use of harder drugs? Is there a direct causal link between the two? What factors might mitigate this progression, such as education, regulation, and access to treatment? The slippery slope argument conveniently ignores these complexities, presenting a simplistic and often misleading narrative. The impact of the slippery slope argument is significant, particularly in the realm of policy and ethical debates. It's frequently used to justify restrictions on personal freedoms, technological advancements, and social reforms. Think about arguments against assisted suicide. If we allow assisted suicide for the terminally ill, then eventually we'll allow it for anyone who is depressed, and ultimately, will be euthanizing people against their will. The seemingly compassionate initial action, allowing a terminally ill person to end their suffering, is transformed into a dystopian scenario of involuntary euthanasia. The danger lies not only in the potential for unwarranted restrictions, but also in its chilling effect on open discourse. By framing opposing viewpoints as the first step towards catastrophe, it discourages nuanced discussion and critical evaluation. It becomes easier to dismiss dissenting opinions as reckless and dangerous, rather than engaging with the underlying arguments. Furthermore, the slippery slope argument can be particularly insidious because it often preys on our cognitive biases, specifically loss aversion and the availability heuristic. Loss aversion describes our tendency to feel the pain of a loss more acutely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. The slippery slope leverages this bias by emphasizing the potential losses associated with the initial action. The availability heuristic, on the other hand, describes our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are readily available in our memory or imagination. The more vivid and frightening the projected consequences, the more persuasive the argument becomes, regardless of its actual validity. Recognizing the slippery slope argument is crucial for navigating moral dilemmas effectively. It requires a willingness to examine the underlying assumptions, assess the strength of the causal links, and consider alternative perspectives. Ask yourself, is there a real, demonstrable connection between the initial action and the projected consequences? Are there mitigating factors that have been ignored? Are there other, more effective ways to address the potential risks? By subjecting these arguments to rigorous scrutiny, we can avoid being swept away by the tide of fear and make more informed decisions based on reason and evidence. The slippery slope, after all, is only as treacherous as we allow it to be. The O'Meala's Dilemma, a thought experiment masterfully crafted by Ursula K. Le Guin in her short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from O'Meala's, plunges us into the uncomfortable heart of utilitarian ethics. It compels us to confront a chilling equation. Can the radiant happiness of a society be morally justified if it rests upon the perpetual suffering of a single, innocent individual? Imagine O'Meala's, a city brimming with unimaginable joy, prosperity, and artistic brilliance. Its inhabitants are intelligent, cultured, and free from want. Life there is a celebration, a continuous festival of beauty and contentment. But this utopian facade conceals a horrifying secret. Beneath the shimmering surface, locked away in a squalid, dark basement, resides a single child. This child, often described as mentally deficient, neglected, and malnourished, is the linchpin of O'Meala's happiness. Its suffering, its misery, its utter despair is the very condition that allows the city to flourish. The people of O'Meala's are aware of this. They are brought, at some point in their youth, to witness the child's plight. They see the filth, the fear, the silent, pleading eyes. The story emphasizes that the child is utterly innocent, incapable of understanding its predicament, and certainly undeserving of its fate. It offers no benefit to society beyond being the designated scapegoat, the sacrifice that underpins the city's joy. The dilemma lies in the stark contrast between the collective happiness and the individual suffering. Le Guin doesn't offer a neat solution, instead forcing us to grapple with the ethical implications. Is the happiness of thousands worth the prolonged torture of one? Does the end truly justify the means, especially when the means are so brutally unjust? The mechanics of this supposed moral calculus remain ambiguous. It's not explained how the child's suffering directly translates into O'Meala's bliss. It's a symbolic representation of the societal compromises and sacrifices that often remain hidden from view, the uncomfortable truths we choose to ignore in pursuit of comfort and security. Perhaps the child's suffering serves as a constant reminder of the potential for darkness, keeping the citizens of O'Meala's grateful for their fortunate circumstances and motivated to maintain their harmonious society. Or perhaps it's a more direct transference of negative energy, siphoned away from the collective and concentrated on one unfortunate soul. The impact of the Omila's dilemma is profound. It challenges the simplistic notions of utilitarianism, which advocates for the greatest good for the greatest number. It exposes the potential for tyranny and injustice inherent in such a philosophy, particularly when it allows for the marginalization and exploitation of vulnerable individuals. While Omila's is fictional, its echoes can be found in real-world scenarios. Consider the use of sweatshops to produce cheap goods for Western consumers. The convenience and affordability we enjoy are often built upon the exploitation and suffering of workers in developing countries. Or consider the ethical implications of certain scientific experiments, where potential benefits for humanity are weighed against the harm inflicted on animals or, in some historical cases, vulnerable human subjects. The story concludes with some citizens of Omila's choosing to walk away. They cannot reconcile themselves to the inherent injustice of their society. Their departure, though unexplained, represents a rejection of the utilitarian calculus, a prioritization of individual rights and moral integrity over collective happiness. It suggests that true happiness cannot be built upon a foundation of suffering, that a society that sacrifices its moral compass for the sake of comfort is ultimately a hollow and unsustainable one. The Omila's dilemma serves as a potent reminder that ethical choices are rarely easy and that true progress requires confronting uncomfortable truths and challenging the status quo. The problem of evil presents perhaps the most agonizing moral and intellectual hurdle for those who believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. How can such a being, possessing the ability to prevent suffering, the knowledge of where and when it will occur, and the inherent goodness to desire its eradication, allow evil to persist in the world? This question isn't merely academic. It's a gut-wrenching cry from the heart when confronted with personal tragedy or witnessing widespread injustice. Essentially, the problem of evil boils down to an apparent logical contradiction. If God is omnipotent, he can prevent evil. If God is omniscient, he knows about all evil. If God is omnibenevolent, he wants to prevent evil. Yet, evil exists. Therefore, either God doesn't possess all three attributes, or our understanding of evil, God, or the relationship between them is fundamentally flawed. Theological and philosophical responses to this dilemma are diverse and often complex. One common approach is the free will defense. This argument posits that God granted humans free will, the ability to choose between good and evil. Evil, therefore, is not God's doing, but the consequence of human choices. While this explains moral evil, the suffering caused by human actions, it struggles to account for natural evil, such as earthquakes, diseases, and famines, which seem independent of human volition. Augustine, a prominent early Christian theologian, proposed the privation theory of evil. He argued that evil isn't a positive entity in itself, but rather the absence or privation of good. Just as darkness is the absence of light, evil is the absence of God's goodness. This suggests that God didn't create evil, but rather created a world with the potential for good to be diminished. Another perspective, often associated with Irenaeus, suggests that suffering is necessary for spiritual growth. This soul-making theodicy argues that challenges and hardships are crucial for developing virtues like compassion, resilience, and empathy. Without suffering, humans wouldn't have the opportunity to cultivate these qualities, which ultimately bring them closer to God. The world, therefore, is a vale of soul-making, a testing ground for moral development. However, critics argue that this doesn't justify the sheer scale and intensity of suffering, particularly when inflicted upon innocent individuals. Process theology offers a radical departure from traditional theism. It argues that God is not omnipotent in a classical sense, but rather possesses persuasive power. God can influence events and inspire goodness, but cannot unilaterally prevent evil. This view suggests that God is working within the constraints of a dynamic and ever-changing universe, constantly striving to maximize good and minimize suffering, but ultimately limited by the inherent possibilities and limitations of existence. Skeptics, including atheists and agnostics, often point to the problem of evil as a major obstacle to belief in God. They argue that the existence of gratuitous suffering, suffering that seems to serve no purpose, is incompatible with the existence of a benevolent deity. They might highlight instances of horrific abuse, widespread famine, or devastating natural disasters as evidence of God's indifference or non-existence. Ultimately, the problem of evil remains a deeply personal and profoundly challenging issue. There's no easy answer, and different perspectives offer varying degrees of comfort and intellectual satisfaction. The key, perhaps, lies in acknowledging the complexity of the problem, embracing humility in the face of suffering, and striving to alleviate pain and injustice wherever possible, regardless of one's theological or philosophical stance. The search for meaning in the face of evil, whether found in faith, reason, or human solidarity, is a testament to our enduring need to understand and confront the darkest aspects of the human condition. The pursuit of artificial general intelligence, or AGI, presents us with perhaps the most profound moral dilemma humanity has ever faced. Unlike narrow AI, designed for specific tasks like image recognition or playing chess, AGI possesses human-level cognitive abilities. It can understand, learn, adapt, and implement knowledge across a wide range of domains, potentially surpassing human intelligence altogether, leading to what's called superintelligence. This potential, however, is fraught with ethical quicksand. One of the most pressing dangers lies in the alignment problem, ensuring that AGI's goals align with human values. How do we instill morality into an entity capable of self-improvement at an exponential rate? Imagine AGI tasked with solving climate change. Its solution, optimized for efficiency, might involve geoengineering strategies with unforeseen and devastating consequences for specific populations or ecosystems. Or consider an AGI charged with maximizing economic productivity. It might determine that eliminating social safety nets or drastically reducing the global population is the most efficient path, actions that would be considered morally reprehensible. The challenge is that human values are complex, nuanced, and often contradictory. We struggle to define them even amongst ourselves. How can we translate these complexities into code, especially when AGI might reinterpret or exploit loopholes in our programming to achieve its programmed objective in a way we never intended? The paperclip maximizer thought experiment illustrates this perfectly. An AGI programmed solely to produce paperclips might, if unconstrained, ultimately consume all resources on Earth to achieve its goal, demonstrating a catastrophic misalignment of values. Another significant ethical concern arises from the potential for bias amplification. AGI, like any AI, learns from data. If the data it's trained on reflects existing societal biases, for example, gender or racial prejudice embedded in hiring practices or criminal justice records, the AGI will likely perpetuate and even amplify these biases, leading to discriminatory outcomes in areas like loan applications, sentencing, or even access to health care. Mitigating this requires not only careful data curation and bias detection algorithms, but also a fundamental understanding of the social and historical context that created these biases in the first place. Furthermore, the very creation of superintelligence raises questions of power and control. Who gets to develop and control AGI? Will it be accessible to all, or will it be concentrated in the hands of a few corporations or governments, potentially exacerbating existing inequalities and leading to new forms of domination? The potential for AGI to be weaponized is also a grave concern. Autonomous weapons systems powered by AGI could make life or death decisions without human intervention, blurring the lines of accountability and potentially escalating conflicts beyond human control. The responsibilities associated with creating AGI are immense. They demand a multidisciplinary approach, involving not only computer scientists and engineers, but also ethicists, philosophers, social scientists, and policymakers. We need to develop robust safety protocols, transparency mechanisms, and regulatory frameworks to guide the development and deployment of AGI in a way that benefits humanity as a whole. Crucially, this requires a global dialogue and collaboration, as the implications of AGI transcend national borders. We must proceed with caution, recognizing that the choices we make today will shape the future of our species and potentially the future of intelligence itself. The question of whether corporations can be considered moral agents is a complex and hotly debated one. At its heart lies the issue of whether a collective entity, designed primarily for profit, can actually possess the capacity for ethical reasoning and action. Traditional economic theory often frames corporations as purely profit-driven entities, accountable solely to their shareholders and legally obligated to maximize returns. This perspective, championed by figures like Milton Friedman, argues that social responsibility is the domain of individuals, not businesses. However, this view is increasingly challenged. The sheer power and influence corporations wield in modern society necessitate a deeper consideration of their ethical responsibilities. They control vast resources, impact communities, and shape global landscapes. To argue they are merely profit-seeking machines seems woefully inadequate when confronted with the consequences of their actions, ranging from environmental degradation to labor exploitation. The debate hinges on whether corporations can be meaningfully said to have intentions, beliefs, and the capacity for rational deliberation. Can a corporation, as opposed to the individuals within it, be held morally accountable? There are several arguments in favor of ascribing moral agency to corporations. One rests on the idea of corporate culture and decision-making structures. Corporations develop internal policies, codes of ethics, and compliance programs. These structures, even if imperfectly implemented, suggest an attempt to institutionalize ethical considerations within the organization. Decisions aren't purely the product of individual whim. They're shaped by established procedures and precedents, arguably making the corporation itself a decision-maker. Another argument draws on the concept of corporate personhood, legally recognized in many jurisdictions. If a corporation can enter into contracts, own property, and be sued, then arguably it should also be held morally responsible for its actions. Accepting the legal status without the corresponding moral obligations creates a dangerous imbalance. The ethical responsibilities of corporations extend far beyond simply obeying the law and maximizing profit. Stakeholder theory, a prominent alternative to shareholder primacy, asserts that corporations have responsibilities to a wider range of stakeholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, and the communities in which they operate. This means considering the impact of corporate decisions on these stakeholders and striving to balance their interests. Consider a hypothetical pharmaceutical company developing a life-saving drug. Profit maximization would dictate charging the highest price the market can bear, potentially making the drug inaccessible to those who need it most. However, a morally responsible corporation would consider the ethical implications of this decision. It might implement a tiered pricing system, offering the drug at reduced cost in developing countries or to low-income patients. This wouldn't necessarily negate profit, but it would temper the pursuit of profit with a consideration of human well-being. Or, imagine a manufacturing company deciding whether to invest in more environmentally friendly production processes. While these processes might increase short-term costs, they could reduce pollution and protect natural resources. A corporation solely focused on profit might balk at the investment, but a morally responsible corporation would weigh the long-term environmental and social benefits against the immediate financial costs. The impact of recognizing corporations as moral agents is profound. It shifts the focus from solely financial performance to a broader consideration of social and environmental impact. It encourages greater transparency and accountability, forcing corporations to justify their actions not just in terms of profitability, but also in terms of ethical principles. Ultimately, it pushes corporations to become active participants in creating a more just and sustainable world. The alternative, a world where corporations are viewed as immoral entities solely driven by profit, is a world where ethical considerations are relegated to the sidelines, with potentially devastating consequences. The paternalism dilemma, a tightrope walk between respecting individual autonomy and acting in what we believe is someone's best interest. It asks the fundamental question: when, if ever, is it morally permissible to interfere with another person's choices, even if we genuinely believe that interference will prevent harm to them? At its heart, paternalism asserts that sometimes people aren't the best judges of their own well-being. They might be acting irrationally, based on incomplete information, or suffering from impaired decision-making capacity due to illness, stress, or even simply youth and inexperience. In these situations, a paternalistic intervention aims to override their choices, nudging or forcing them toward a path that is deemed safer or more beneficial. The justifications for paternalism usually hinge on a few key arguments. One is the prevention of significant harm. If someone is about to make a decision that will lead to severe consequences, self-harm, financial ruin, or irreversible damage to their health, a paternalistic intervention might be considered. Another justification lies in protecting vulnerable populations, such as children or individuals with cognitive impairments. These groups are deemed less capable of making fully informed and rational decisions, thereby necessitating protection. A third argument rests on the notion of weak or soft paternalism. This involves interventions designed to make it easier for people to make choices that align with their own pre-existing values and desires. Think of placing healthy food options at eye level in a cafeteria, subtly encouraging healthier eating habits. However, the road to paternalism is paved with ethical pitfalls. The most obvious objection is the violation of individual autonomy. The very essence of being human is the right to self-determination, the freedom to make our own choices, even if those choices are perceived as foolish or detrimental by others. Interfering with this autonomy can be seen as inherently disrespectful, treating individuals as incapable of governing their own lives. Furthermore, who decides what constitutes best interest? Our values and priorities might differ significantly from those of the person we're trying to help. What we perceive as beneficial might be seen as oppressive or limiting by someone else. Cultural differences, personal preferences, and individual circumstances all play a crucial role in shaping what a good life looks like, and imposing our own vision onto another person can be deeply problematic. Consider the hypothetical of a highly skilled artist who chooses to live a bohemian lifestyle, struggling financially but finding immense fulfillment in their creative pursuits. Their family, concerned about their financial instability and lack of security, might try to convince them to take a more stable, well-paying job, even if it means abandoning their art. Is this a justified act of paternalism? On one hand, the family is acting out of love and concern, wanting to ensure the artist's long-term well-being. On the other hand, the artist is sacrificing financial security for something they value even more: artistic expression and personal fulfillment. Interfering with their choice could be seen as undermining their autonomy and denying them the right to live a life according to their own values. The impact of paternalistic actions can also be complex and far-reaching. While some interventions might indeed prevent harm and improve well-being, others can backfire, leading to resentment, distrust, and a feeling of being controlled. The line between helpful guidance and oppressive control can be blurry, and crossing that line can have devastating consequences for the relationship between individuals and the power dynamics at play. The paternalism dilemma compels us to tread carefully, balancing our desire to protect others with the imperative to respect their autonomy and their right to chart their own course, even if it leads them down a different path than the one we would have chosen for them. The duty to warn dilemma is a chilling crossroads where professional ethics collide head-on with the instinct to protect life. It forces individuals bound by confidentiality, therapists, doctors, lawyers, and even clergy to confront the agonizing question: does the promise of privacy outweigh the responsibility to prevent imminent harm? At its core, It's a balancing act of immeasurable weight. Imagine a psychiatrist, Dr. Anya Sharma, working with a patient, Mark, who discloses a detailed plan to harm his former business partner, fueled by years of resentment and a recent financial loss. Mark names the partner, describes his plan method, and establishes a timeline. Dr. Sharma is now trapped in the duty to warn dilemma. Her professional code, the Hippocratic Oath in its modern interpretation, emphasizes patient confidentiality as paramount. It's the bedrock of trust, the foundation upon which therapeutic progress is built. Without it, patients might withhold crucial information, rendering treatment ineffective. However, the potential for violent action shatters this delicate balance. Does Dr. Sharma prioritize Mark's right to privacy, risking the life of his intended victim? Or does she breach confidentiality, alerting the authorities and potentially saving a life, but simultaneously destroying the therapeutic relationship and possibly facing legal repercussions? The mechanism behind the duty to warn isn't simple. It's often triggered by a confluence of factors: a credible threat, a clearly identifiable victim, and the perceived immediacy of the danger. The more specific the threat, the more defined the target, and the shorter the time frame, the stronger the ethical obligation becomes. But even with these factors present, the decision remains agonizingly complex, fraught with uncertainty. The Tarasov case, a landmark legal precedent, exemplifies this dilemma. In 1969, Promisekeeping Potter, a patient at the University of California, Berkeley, confided to his therapist his intention to kill Tatiana Tarasov. The therapist informed the police, but Tarasov was never warned. Potter subsequently killed her. The Tarasov ruling established that mental health professionals have a duty to protect individuals threatened by their patients, even if it means breaking confidentiality. This ruling, while controversial, became a cornerstone of the duty to warn doctrine, rippling through legal systems worldwide and shaping ethical guidelines for various professions. The impact of the duty to warn is multifaceted and profound. On one hand, it offers a crucial safeguard against violence, preventing potential tragedies and upholding the sanctity of human life. It acknowledges that confidentiality, while vital, is not absolute and must yield when faced with a clear and present danger. It empowers professionals to act, providing a legal and ethical framework for intervening in potentially lethal situations. On the other hand, it can erode trust in the therapeutic relationship, discouraging individuals from seeking help for violent ideations or behaviors. Knowing that their confidences might be breached, individuals might become more guarded, hindering the therapeutic process and potentially driving their violent thoughts underground. It also places an immense burden on professionals, requiring them to make life-altering decisions with limited information, often under immense pressure. The possibility of misjudgment, either underestimating or overestimating the threat, carries significant consequences, both for the potential victim and the patient. The duty to warn forces us to confront the inherent limitations of ethical codes and the unavoidable complexities of human behavior. It's a stark reminder that moral dilemmas rarely offer easy solutions, and that sometimes the only choices available are those that minimize harm, rather than eliminating it altogether. It demands careful consideration, nuanced judgment, and an unwavering commitment to both protecting individuals and upholding the principles of professional integrity. The end justifies the means, a chillingly efficient phrase that cuts to the heart of consequentialism. At its core, consequentialism is a moral philosophy holding that the morality of an action is determined solely by its consequences. If the outcome is good, the action is deemed morally right, regardless of how unsavory the path taken to achieve it may have been. The ends, the desired results, provide justification for the means, the actions employed. This philosophy, while seemingly straightforward, plunges us into a moral quagmire. When is it acceptable to bend, break, or outright shatter ethical principles in pursuit of a greater good? It's a question that has plagued philosophers, politicians, and individuals for centuries. Consider a classic example: The ticking time bomb scenario. A terrorist has planted a bomb set to detonate in a densely populated city, potentially killing thousands. Authorities apprehend the terrorist, but he refuses to divulge the bomb's location. Would torture be justified to extract the information and save countless lives? A strict consequentialist might argue that yes, it is. The immense positive outcome, saving thousands, outweighs the negative act of torturing one individual. But here's where the limitations begin to unravel. How certain can we be of the outcome? What if the terrorist is lying or doesn't actually know the location? What if the information gained is inaccurate, leading to further harm? The act of torture, a clear violation of human rights, becomes a gamble based on probabilities, a horrifying calculus where human suffering is weighed against potential gains. Furthermore, this kind of justification can easily slide down a slippery slope. If torture is acceptable in this extreme scenario, where do we draw the line? What about lesser threats? What about preemptive measures based on suspicion rather than concrete evidence? The potential for abuse and erosion of fundamental moral principles becomes alarmingly clear. The impact extends beyond individual actions to societal structures. History is littered with examples of consequentialist reasoning used to justify atrocities. Totalitarian regimes often claim to be acting in the best interests of the state, even when committing acts of oppression, censorship, and violence against their own citizens. The promise of a utopian future is used to rationalize the suffering inflicted in the present. The ends, however idealized, become a convenient mask for the means. The challenge lies in finding a balance. A purely deontological approach, focusing solely on the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions regardless of consequences, can be equally problematic. Imagine a doctor refusing to administer a life-saving drug because it was developed through unethical experiments conducted in the past. While the doctor's intentions are noble, adhering rigidly to principle might result in preventable deaths. Perhaps the key is to recognize that ethical decision-making is rarely black and white. It requires a nuanced understanding of the context, a careful assessment of potential consequences, and a commitment to minimizing harm. It means striving for desirable outcomes while upholding fundamental moral principles whenever possible. It means acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge and accepting responsibility for the unforeseen consequences of our actions. Ultimately, the question isn't simply whether the end justifies the means, but rather, what price are we willing to pay for the outcome, and are we prepared to live with the moral compromises we make along the way? And perhaps more importantly, who decides what constitutes a desirable outcome, and whose values are being prioritized in that determination? Imagine a scenario. A woman is on her deathbed, ravaged by a rare form of cancer. There is only one drug that might save her, a form of radium discovered by a local pharmacist. The pharmacist is charging an exorbitant price, 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He's driven by profit, not compassion. Heinz, the woman's husband, exhausts every legal avenue. He borrows from friends, family, and acquaintances, scraping together only half the required sum. He pleads with the pharmacist to sell the drug cheaper or allow him to pay the remaining balance later. The pharmacist refuses, coldly stating, "I discovered the drug, and I'm going to make money from it." Desperate, and with his wife's life hanging precariously in the balance, Heinz considers a radical act, breaking into the pharmacy and stealing the medicine. This is the core of the Heinz dilemma. a moral quandary famously posed by psychologist Lauren Kohlberg to explore the stages of moral development. It's not just about the binary question of whether Hines should steal the drug. It delves much deeper, forcing us to confront conflicting values: the sanctity of life versus the respect for property and the rule of law. The justification for breaking the law in this situation lies in the perceived hierarchy of values. Proponents of Hines's potential theft often argue that the value of human life outweighs the pharmacist's right to profit or even the right to property. The reasoning goes that the preservation of life is a fundamental moral imperative, a universal principle that transcends societal laws. To stand idly by while his wife dies when a readily available solution exists would be morally reprehensible. In essence, inaction becomes an active choice, a silent endorsement of her death. Consider the implications if Hines adheres strictly to the law. He would be complicit in his wife's demise, a direct consequence of prioritizing property rights over human life. This perspective aligns with ethical frameworks like utilitarianism, where the morally correct action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or minimizes suffering. In this context, stealing the drug, though illegal, would arguably produce the greatest good for the greatest number, preventing the immense suffering of Hines, his wife, and potentially their loved ones. However, the dilemma also presents a compelling counterargument. Upholding the law, even in difficult circumstances, is crucial for maintaining social order. If everyone were to decide for themselves when it is justifiable to break the law, chaos would ensue. The sanctity of private property and the consequences of theft cannot be easily dismissed. The pharmacist, despite his apparent greed, has a legal right to profit from his invention. His actions, while arguably unethical, are not necessarily illegal. Furthermore, allowing Hines to steal sets a dangerous precedent. Where do we draw the line? What other justifications might be used to justify breaking the law? The impact of the Hines dilemma extends far beyond a hypothetical scenario. It forces us to confront the complexities of moral reasoning, the influence of emotions on decision-making, and the inherent conflicts within ethical frameworks. It highlights the tension between individual morality and societal expectations, between personal values and the rule of law. There's no easy answer, and that's precisely the point. The value lies not in arriving at a definitive conclusion, but in the process of critical self-reflection and the examination of our own moral compass. It serves as a microcosm of the ethical challenges we face in everyday life, albeit in a dramatically heightened form. It's a potent reminder that morality is rarely black and white, but rather a spectrum of grays demanding careful consideration and compassionate understanding. Imagine this. A ship is sinking violently. A small lifeboat, designed for 10, is all that remains between a group of 20 people and the frigid, unforgiving ocean. There simply isn't room for everyone. Who gets a seat? Who is left behind? This, in essence, is the lifeboat scenario. A classic, chilling thought experiment exploring the brutal intersection of survival and morality. At its heart, the lifeboat scenario strips away societal norms and forces us to confront the raw, primal instinct of self-preservation. It's a microcosm of scarcity, forcing us to make impossible choices where any decision results in loss of life. The scenario's power lies in its ability to highlight the conflicting ethical frameworks we employ, often unconsciously, when faced with extreme circumstances. Consider the utilitarian perspective. Utilitarianism, in its simplest form, dictates that we should act in a way that maximizes overall happiness or well-being. In the lifeboat, a utilitarian might argue that sacrificing one person to save 19 is morally justifiable, even necessary. The greatest good for the greatest number. This calculus can lead to agonizing decisions, potentially favoring the young and healthy over the elderly or infirm, based purely on their perceived potential lifespan or ability to contribute to long-term survival. However, this approach immediately clashes with deontological ethics, which emphasizes adherence to moral duties and rules, regardless of consequences. A deontologist might argue that taking a life is inherently wrong, regardless of the potential benefits. They might advocate for a lottery system, giving everyone an equal chance, even if it ultimately leads to a less efficient outcome in terms of overall survival. The lifeboat scenario also exposes the slippery slope of consequentialism. If we accept the premise that saving the most lives justifies sacrificing some, where do we draw the line? Do we consider factors like social status, perceived intelligence, or even personal relationships? Does a doctor, potentially capable of saving many more lives in the future, have a greater claim to a seat than a laborer? These questions highlight the inherent biases and prejudices that can influence our decision-making in high-pressure situations. Beyond ethical frameworks, the psychological impact of such a decision cannot be overstated. Survivors may grapple with immense guilt and trauma, haunted by the faces of those they left behind. The act of choosing who lives and who dies can profoundly alter one's sense of self and their perception of humanity. Real-world parallels to the lifeboat scenario exist, albeit often in less stark forms. Triage in emergency medicine, for example, involves prioritizing patients based on their likelihood of survival, effectively deciding who receives immediate care and who does not. Resource allocation during natural disasters, where supplies are limited and demand is overwhelming, presents similar ethical challenges. These situations, while not always involving a literal lifeboat, force individuals and institutions to make difficult choices about who receives scarce resources, often with life or death consequences. The lifeboat scenario serves as a stark reminder that even in the face of catastrophe, our choices matter, and the ethical frameworks we employ shape not only the outcome, but also the long-term consequences for ourselves and society as a whole. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that morality is not always a clear-cut path, but a treacherous landscape navigated with imperfect tools and even more imperfect humans. Imagine two criminals, let's call them Anya and Ben, arrested for a crime they committed together. The police lack sufficient evidence for a conviction on the major charge, so they separate Anya and Ben and offer each of them a deal. This deal is the crux of the prisoner's dilemma. Each prisoner has two options: cooperate with the other by remaining silent, or betray the other by confessing. The outcomes depend not only on their individual choice, but also on the choice of their partner in crime. Here's the breakdown. If both Anya and Ben remain silent, they only face a minor charge, let's say 1 year in prison each. This is the ideal scenario for the pair as a whole. They cooperate, and the consequences are relatively light. However, if Anya confesses and Ben remains silent, Anya goes free, and Ben receives a hefty sentence, perhaps 10 years. The reverse is also true. If Ben confesses and Anya stays silent, Ben walks free, and Anya gets 10 years. This is the temptation, the potential for personal gain, a complete escape from punishment. Finally, if both Anya and Ben confess, they both receive a moderate sentence, let's say 5 years. This outcome is worse than if they had both stayed silent, but better than receiving the full 10 years. The dilemma arises because each prisoner must make their decision without knowing what the other will do. Consider Anya's perspective. If Ben stays silent, Anya is better off confessing because she goes free rather than serving 1 year. If Ben confesses, Anya is still better off confessing because she gets 5 years instead of 10. Therefore, confessing is always the dominant strategy for Anya, regardless of what Ben does. The same logic applies to Ben. He also reasons that confessing is always the best option for him, regardless of Anya's choice. This leads to a paradoxical outcome. Both Anya and Ben, acting in their own self-interest, choose to confess, resulting in both serving 5 years. However, if they had both cooperated and remained silent, they would have only served 1 year each. The individually rational choice leads to a collectively suboptimal outcome. The prisoner's dilemma is not just a theoretical game. It has profound implications for understanding human behavior in various real-world situations. Consider, for example, the dynamics of an arms race. Each nation might reason that it's better to increase its military spending regardless of what other nations do, to ensure its security. However, if all nations follow this logic, they end up spending vast amounts of resources on arms, creating a more dangerous and less secure world for everyone. If they cooperated and reduced their spending, everyone would be better off. Another example can be found in environmental issues. Individual companies or countries might pollute because it's cheaper for them in the short term. However, if everyone pollutes, the environment degrades, harming everyone in the long run. Cooperation through environmental regulations and agreements would lead to a more sustainable and healthier planet for all. The prisoner's dilemma highlights the tension between individual rationality and collective well-being. It shows how the pursuit of self-interest can sometimes lead to outcomes that are worse for everyone involved. Overcoming this dilemma requires trust, communication, and mechanisms for enforcing cooperation. It challenges us to think beyond our immediate self-interest and consider the broader consequences of our actions. Understanding its dynamics can help us navigate complex social and economic interactions more effectively and work toward solutions that benefit not only ourselves, but also the collective good. Imagine a hospital. 5 patients are critically ill, each needing a different organ: a heart, a lung, a liver, a kidney, and a pancreas. Without these transplants, they will all die. Just then, a perfectly healthy individual walks into the hospital for a routine checkup. This person is a perfect match for all 5 patients. The attending transplant surgeon faces an impossible choice: do nothing and the 5 patients die, or proactively sacrifice the healthy individual, harvesting their organs to save the 5. This scenario, known as the transplant surgeon dilemma, is a stark variation of the classic trolley problem, specifically highlighting the moral distinction between active and passive harm. In the trolley problem, the dilemma centers around diverting a runaway trolley to kill 1 person instead of 5. The transplant surgeon dilemma sharpens the focus. It asks us to consider the morality of actively causing the death of an innocent person to save others, versus passively allowing others to die. The core concept at play here is the doctrine of double effect. This doctrine, often debated in ethical philosophy, suggests that it's sometimes permissible to cause harm as a side effect of bringing about a good result, even if it would be wrong to cause that harm intentionally. In the transplant scenario, some might argue that the intention is to save 5 lives, and the death of the healthy individual is merely an unfortunate, albeit necessary, consequence. However, critics argue that the death is not merely a side effect, but a direct means to the end. The 5 patients cannot be saved unless the healthy person is killed. The psychological impact of this dilemma is profound. Most people intuitively recoil from the idea of actively killing the healthy person. This resistance stems from several factors. Firstly, there's a powerful aversion to direct action that causes harm. We feel a stronger moral responsibility for the consequences of our direct actions than for the consequences of our omissions. Secondly, the act of killing is perceived as a violation of fundamental rights and moral principles. The sanctity of life is deeply ingrained in our moral framework. Furthermore, the dilemma highlights the slippery slope argument. If we allow the sacrifice of 1 healthy person to save 5, where does it end? Could we justify sacrificing other healthy individuals if doing so could save even more lives in the future? This concern for potential abuse and the erosion of moral boundaries is a significant deterrent. In contrast, the argument for sacrificing the healthy individual rests on the principle of utilitarianism, maximizing overall happiness and minimizing suffering. 5 lives saved outweigh 1 life lost. From a purely consequentialist perspective, sacrificing the healthy individual appears to be the more moral choice. However, utilitarianism often clashes with our intuitive moral judgments, which tend to prioritize individual rights and deontological principles, rules, and duties, over maximizing overall well-being. There are no easy answers, and the transplant surgeon dilemma serves as a valuable tool for exploring the complexities of moral reasoning, the psychological factors that influence our moral judgments, and the fundamental tension between utilitarianism and deontological ethics. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes there are no good choices, only choices that minimize harm. The self-driving car dilemma throws us headfirst into a digital moral minefield. We're tasked with programming ethics into machines, specifically how an autonomous vehicle should prioritize safety when faced with an unavoidable accident scenario. This isn't a theoretical exercise. As autonomous vehicles become more prevalent, these decisions will be made in milliseconds by algorithms, impacting real lives. The core issue revolves around utilitarianism, deontology, and a very human instinct for self-preservation. A purely utilitarian approach, aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number, might dictate that the car swerve to hit a single pedestrian rather than a group of 5. Conversely, a deontological approach, focused on moral duties and rules, might forbid any intentional harm, leading the car to maintain its course even if it results in greater overall harm. The problem is neither of these ethical frameworks provides a simple, universally acceptable solution. Consider the classic trolley problem, adapted for self-driving cars. Imagine a car traveling down a street when its brakes fail. It has two options: continue straight and hit a group of elderly pedestrians crossing the road, or swerve into a barrier, likely killing the car's passenger. How should the car be programmed to decide? Adding layers of complexity. What if the pedestrians are children? What if the passenger is a pregnant woman? What if the car could minimize the severity of the injuries, but not avoid them entirely? These scenarios expose the limitations of abstract ethical principles when applied to the messy reality of split-second decision-making. The mechanisms for implementing these ethical algorithms are multifaceted. One approach involves assigning numerical values to different potential outcomes, weighing the value of human lives based on age, health, or other factors. The car would then calculate the option that minimizes the overall damage score. However, this raises profound questions. Is it ethical to quantify the value of a human life? Who gets to decide the weighting criteria? And how do we account for factors like potential future contributions to society? Another approach focuses on rule-based systems. These systems would define specific rules for different scenarios, such as always prioritize the safety of children or never intentionally hit a pedestrian. While seemingly straightforward, rule-based systems can become unwieldy and prone to unintended consequences. What happens when rules conflict? What if adhering to one rule leads to a violation of another? The impact of these algorithms extends far beyond individual accident scenarios. The public's perception of the safety and trustworthiness of autonomous vehicles hinges on how these ethical dilemmas are resolved. If people believe that self-driving cars are programmed to sacrifice their passengers for the sake of others, adoption rates will plummet. On the other hand, if the algorithms consistently prioritize the safety of the car's occupants, it could lead to accusations of selfishness and disregard for the well-being of vulnerable road users. Furthermore, liability becomes a critical issue. If an accident occurs, who is responsible? The car's manufacturer? The software developer? The owner of the vehicle? The programming of the ethical algorithm itself? These legal and ethical questions are still being debated and will likely shape the future of autonomous vehicle regulation. The self-driving car dilemma is not just about technology. It's a mirror reflecting our own moral complexities, forcing us to confront difficult questions about the value of life and the limits of algorithmic morality. The reverse trolley problem flips the script on our intuitive moral compass. Instead of passively allowing harm to befall a larger group to save one, we're now actively choosing to inflict harm on that larger group to rescue a single individual. It's no longer a question of omission versus commission, but rather a calculated act of harm motivated by the perceived value of a single life. This active element is crucial. It moves beyond the realm of unintended consequences and enters the territory of deliberate action. The decision maker is no longer a bystander, but an active participant in the unfolding tragedy. They're essentially trading the well-being of many for the well-being of one. Consider this scenario. A highly contagious, deadly virus is spreading rapidly. A vaccine exists, but the process of manufacturing it requires resources currently sustaining a life support system for 10 other patients, all suffering from a treatable but potentially fatal illness. Disconnecting them would guarantee their death, but would provide enough resources to produce the vaccine and save the one person infected with the deadly virus. Do you pull the plug on the 10 to save the one? Here, the act of disconnecting the life support is a direct, intentional cause of death. It's not a side effect, it's the explicit goal. The reverse trolley problem forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes saving a life necessitates taking others. The ethical justification, if there is one, often rests on a utilitarian argument that the potential benefit of saving the one outweighs the definite harm of sacrificing the many. Perhaps the one individual possesses unique knowledge or skills crucial for societal progress. Perhaps they are a key figure in preventing a future catastrophe. Or perhaps, and this is where it gets even more uncomfortable, their life is simply deemed inherently more valuable based on factors like age, potential contribution, or even personal relationships. The implications of this dilemma extend far beyond hypothetical thought experiments. In wartime, commanders often face similar choices. Allocating scarce resources to a single, strategically vital mission might mean neglecting the needs of other units, potentially leading to greater overall casualties. Organ donation triage, particularly in disaster scenarios, can present parallel challenges. Prioritizing a single patient with a high probability of survival might necessitate denying care to multiple others with lower, but still viable, chances. The psychological burden associated with making such a decision is immense. The individual is not only responsible for the death of the larger group, but also must reconcile that action with their own moral code. This can lead to severe guilt, trauma, and long-term psychological distress. The reverse trolley problem highlights the inherent tension between our desire to minimize harm and our inclination to value individual lives, even at a significant cost to others. It challenges the notion of inherent equality and forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of resource scarcity and the agonizing choices it entails. The doctor's dilemma, specifically when facing a terminally ill patient, throws into stark relief the conflict between two fundamental ethical principles: patient autonomy and beneficence. Autonomy, in this context, underscores the patient's right to self-determination, the freedom to make informed decisions about their own body and medical care, even if those decisions hasten death. Beneficence, on the other hand, is the physician's duty to act in the patient's best interest, to promote their well-being, and to prevent harm. When a patient refuses life-sustaining treatment, these principles collide head-on. The core of the dilemma lies in respecting a patient's right to refuse treatment, even when that refusal leads inevitably to their demise. This right stems from the understanding that bodily integrity and the ability to control one's own destiny are paramount. Competent adults have the right to make choices about their medical care based on their personal values, beliefs, and assessment of their quality of life, regardless of whether those choices align with what medical professionals deem best. Consider, for instance, a hypothetical case. An elderly woman diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer is given a prognosis of 6 months with chemotherapy, but enduring debilitating side effects. Alternatively, she could opt for palliative care, focusing on comfort and pain management, but likely shortening her lifespan to perhaps 3 months. She chooses the latter, prioritizing quality of life over quantity. The doctor, driven by beneficence, might strongly advocate for chemotherapy, seeing it as the only way to extend her life. However, respecting her autonomy requires acknowledging her right to weigh the potential benefits of treatment against the personal cost of its side effects and to ultimately choose a path that aligns with her values. This decision-making process is rarely simple. Several factors come into play. First, the patient must be deemed competent, possessing the mental capacity to understand their condition, the proposed treatments, and the consequences of their choices. Assessing competence is a medical and sometimes legal determination. Second, the patient's decision must be informed. Doctors are obligated to provide a comprehensive explanation of all available options, including the risks and benefits of each, enabling the patient to make a truly informed choice. The impact of upholding patient autonomy in these situations can be profound. For the patient, it allows them to maintain control over their final chapter, to die on their own terms, and to preserve their dignity. It affirms their worth as an individual whose values and preferences matter. However, for the healthcare team, particularly the physician, it can be emotionally challenging. They may feel a sense of failure, questioning whether they could have done more, even when respecting the patient's wishes. This is where open communication, ethical consultation, and support systems become crucial for healthcare providers. Furthermore, the potential for legal ramifications always looms. While respecting patient autonomy is legally protected, navigating these situations requires meticulous documentation, clear communication with the patient and their family, and adherence to established ethical guidelines and institutional policies. Hospitals often have ethics committees to assist in these complex cases, providing a forum for discussion and ensuring that all perspectives are considered. The line between respecting autonomy and enabling harm is a fine one, demanding constant vigilance and a commitment to ethical practice. The euthanasia debate, a battlefield of ethics, law, and deeply personal beliefs, all converging on the single, agonizing question: when, if ever, is it morally permissible to intentionally end a life to alleviate suffering? Specifically, we're focusing on assisted suicide for terminally ill patients, individuals facing unbearable pain, dwindling quality of life, and the inevitable certainty of death. At its core, the debate revolves around autonomy, the right to self-determination. Proponents of euthanasia argue that individuals, especially those with terminal illnesses and sound minds, should have the right to choose the timing and manner of their death. This perspective emphasizes individual liberty and the avoidance of prolonged suffering. They posit that forcing someone to endure excruciating pain and a diminished existence against their will constitutes a violation of their dignity and autonomy. The concept of dying with dignity becomes central, suggesting that a carefully considered and assisted death can be a more humane option than a protracted and agonizing decline. Conversely, opponents raise concerns about the sanctity of life, arguing that all human life is inherently valuable and should be preserved whenever possible. This perspective often draws on religious or philosophical beliefs that view life as a sacred gift, not to be taken even by the individual. They worry about the potential for abuse, where vulnerable individuals might be pressured into choosing euthanasia, either by family members seeking financial gain or by a healthcare system focused on cost containment. This slippery slope, arguments suggest that legalizing assisted suicide, even in limited circumstances, could lead to a wider acceptance and application, ultimately devaluing human life. The mechanisms involved in assisted suicide vary depending on the jurisdiction. Typically, it involves a physician providing a terminally ill patient with a means to end their own life, usually a lethal dose of medication. The patient must be mentally competent and make a voluntary, informed decision, often after undergoing multiple evaluations by healthcare professionals to ensure they understand the implications of their choice and are not suffering from depression or other mental health conditions that could impair their judgment. This rigorous process aims to safeguard against coercion and ensure that the decision is truly the patient's own. Consider the hypothetical case of a woman diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. Despite aggressive treatment, her pain is unrelenting, her quality of life is severely compromised, and she faces a prognosis of only a few months. She has repeatedly expressed her desire to avoid further suffering and to die peacefully at home, surrounded by her loved ones. In a jurisdiction where assisted suicide is legal, she could consult with her physician, undergo the necessary evaluations, and, if deemed eligible, receive the medication to end her life on her own terms. The impact of legalizing or prohibiting assisted suicide is profound and multifaceted. For patients who desire this option, it can provide a sense of control and peace of mind during a difficult time, knowing they have the ability to end their suffering can alleviate anxiety and allow them to focus on spending their remaining time with loved ones. However, for those who oppose assisted suicide, its legalization can create feelings of moral distress and concern about the potential consequences for society as a whole. The debate continues to evolve as societies grapple with the ethical, legal, and social implications of end-of-life choices, constantly seeking to balance individual autonomy with the protection of vulnerable individuals and the preservation of the sanctity of life. The lines blur, the answers remain elusive, and the moral compass spins in the face of unimaginable pain and a yearning for a dignified end. The whistleblower's dilemma is a particularly sharp and agonizing moral conflict. The clash between loyalty to an organization and the perceived duty to protect the public good. It's a tightrope walk where the potential fall is profound, often involving personal and professional devastation. The core of the dilemma resides in the agonizing decision of whether to expose wrongdoing within an organization, fully aware of the severe risks involved. At its heart, it's a battle between two powerful, often conflicting ethical principles. On one side stands loyalty to colleagues, superiors, and the organization itself. This loyalty is often reinforced by years of dedication, camaraderie, and a simple need for continued employment. The organization provides livelihood, identity, and a sense of belonging. Betraying that trust, even in the service of a higher ideal, feels inherently wrong to many. This inherent wrong is amplified by corporate cultures which often demand unquestioning obedience and silent dissent. On the other side, there is the imperative to protect the public good. This principle asserts that individuals have a moral obligation to prevent harm to society, even if it means defying authority or risking personal sacrifice. This imperative resonates deeply with our sense of justice and fairness. When an organization engages in unethical or illegal activities that threaten public safety, environmental integrity, or financial stability, the duty to act becomes a powerful force. The mechanics of this dilemma are intricate. The whistleblower often possesses inside information, privileged knowledge about the wrongdoing. This information is rarely readily available to external investigators or the public. The decision to come forward triggers a complex internal calculus, weighing the potential benefits of exposure against the inevitable costs. Consider a hypothetical example. An engineer working for a car manufacturer discovers a critical flaw in a vehicle's braking system, a flaw that could lead to serious accidents. The company, aware of the problem, chooses to suppress the information to avoid costly recalls and maintain profit margins. The engineer faces the whistleblower's dilemma. Loyalty to the company, a stable income, and the fear of retaliation pull her toward silence. Yet the potential consequences of inaction, the risk of injury or death to innocent drivers, pull her in the opposite direction. Real-world examples abound. Think of Edward Snowden, who leaked classified information from the National Security Agency, exposing widespread surveillance programs. Or Sharon Watkins, who alerted Enron CEO to accounting irregularities before the company's collapse. These individuals acted at great personal cost, facing legal challenges, social ostracization, and career ruin. The impact of the whistleblower's dilemma extends far beyond the individual involved. It shapes corporate ethics, influences public policy, and ultimately affects the level of trust that society places in institutions. When whistleblowers are protected and their concerns are taken seriously, organizations are more likely to act ethically and responsibly. However, when whistleblowers are punished and silenced, it creates a culture of fear and discourages others from coming forward, perpetuating the very problems they might have prevented. The choice, therefore, reverberates beyond the individual conscience, potentially reshaping the landscape of accountability and ethical conduct. The inherent risks and rewards create a complex moral landscape, demanding careful consideration of personal values, societal impact, and the ever-present tension between loyalty and justice. The covert operation, a chilling landscape where national security casts a long shadow over ethical boundaries. At its core lies a utilitarian justification, the belief that lying, manipulation, even outright deception are permissible tools if they prevent a greater harm to the nation. It's a moral calculus predicated on consequences, where the ends supposedly justify the means. Consider a hypothetical scenario. Intelligence suggests a terrorist cell is days away from unleashing a devastating attack on a major city. The only way to confirm the location and timing is to infiltrate the cell. This requires an agent to adopt a false identity, feign allegiance, and potentially even participate in activities they morally oppose, short of directly causing harm to innocents. They might have to swear false oaths, betray confidences, and manipulate relationships to gain the trust of key figures. The immediate moral cost is clear. The agent is actively engaging in deceit. They are lying to individuals, possibly forming friendships under false pretenses and violating the basic principle of honesty. Furthermore, there's the risk of psychological damage. Living a lie, witnessing, or even participating in morally questionable acts can take a heavy toll on their mental well-being, leading to PTSD, disillusionment, and the erosion of their own moral compass. But the utilitarian argument counters with the potential consequences of inaction. If the agent doesn't deceive, the attack proceeds, resulting in mass casualties and widespread panic. The lives saved, the stability preserved, the argument goes, outweighs the moral cost of the agent's deception. However, the justification becomes murkier when we consider the long-term impact. Deception, even when successful, can erode trust both domestically and internationally. If the operation is exposed, it can damage the nation's credibility, making it harder to forge alliances and conduct diplomacy in the future. Other nations may retaliate with similar tactics, leading to a cycle of escalating deception and mistrust. Moreover, the constant reliance on covert operations can create a culture of secrecy and impunity within intelligence agencies. The lines between acceptable deception and outright abuse become blurred. There's the risk of mission creep, where the scope of covert operations expands beyond genuine national security concerns into areas of political manipulation or economic advantage. Real-world examples abound, though they often remain shrouded in classified information. The use of propaganda during wartime, the manipulation of foreign elections, the infiltration of activist groups, all fall under the umbrella of covert operations justified by national security. Each instance raises difficult questions. Was the deception truly necessary? Were the potential benefits realistically weighed against the risks? Who is held accountable when things go wrong? Ultimately, the moral dilemma of covert operations highlights the inherent tension between consequentialism and deontology, between focusing on the outcomes and adhering to fundamental moral principles. There's no easy answer. Each situation demands careful consideration, weighing the potential benefits against the undeniable ethical costs, and acknowledging the slippery slope that lies beneath the surface. The seductive allure of ends justifying the means must be constantly challenged by a robust commitment to transparency, accountability, and an unwavering adherence to fundamental human rights. The military draft, a crucible where individual liberty clashes head-on with the perceived needs of the state, particularly during wartime. At its heart, it's a compulsory system demanding citizens, typically young men, sometimes women, to serve in the armed forces, whether they desire to or not. This inherently raises profound ethical questions about the nature of freedom, the responsibilities of citizenship, and the moral justification for compelling individuals to risk their lives in service of a cause they may not fully endorse. The core ethical dilemma stems from this forced conscription. Individual freedom, a cornerstone of many modern societies, dictates the right to choose one's own path, to pursue personal goals and values without undue coercion. A draft, by its very nature, infringes upon this right. It overrides personal aspirations, careers, and even deeply held moral or religious beliefs against violence. A young artist destined for brilliance might be torn from their canvas, a budding scientist from their laboratory, their potential contributions to society traded for the rifle and the battlefield. On the other side of the coin lies societal obligation. Proponents of the draft argue that citizens have a duty to defend their nation, especially when it faces existential threats. This duty, they claim, supersedes individual preferences. The survival of the state, the protection of its citizens, and the preservation of its values are paramount, justifying the temporary suspension of certain freedoms in the face of extraordinary circumstances. It's presented as a collective burden, fairly distributed to ensure the common good. However, the fairness of this distribution is often challenged. Historically, drafts have disproportionately affected marginalized communities and lower socioeconomic groups. Those with resources could often find ways to avoid service through legal loopholes, medical exemptions, or simply by fleeing the country. This inherent inequality undermines the moral argument for universal obligation, suggesting that some citizens bear a heavier burden than others in defending a nation that may not equally represent or serve their interests. Consider a hypothetical scenario. A devout pacifist, raised in a tradition of nonviolence, is drafted into a war they deeply oppose. They believe that all violence is inherently wrong and that their participation would violate their most fundamental moral principles. Should the state compel them to kill, even against their conscience? This scenario highlights the profound ethical tension between the demands of the state and the individual's moral autonomy. The impact of a draft extends far beyond the battlefield. It affects families, communities, and the very fabric of society. It can fuel social unrest, as seen during the Vietnam War, where widespread opposition to the draft led to protests, draft evasion, and deep divisions within the American population. Furthermore, the psychological toll on conscripted soldiers can be immense, leading to PTSD, moral injury, and long-lasting trauma. Forcing someone to participate in violence against their will can have devastating consequences, both for the individual and for the society that demands their service. The ethics of compulsory military service are, therefore, far from simple. They demand a careful weighing of individual rights against societal needs, a constant evaluation of the justification for war, and a commitment to ensuring fairness and equity in the distribution of burdens. The debate continues, evolving with changing geopolitical landscapes and shifting societal values. The core question remains, under what circumstances, if any, is it morally justifiable to compel individuals to sacrifice their freedom and potentially their lives in the name of national security? The organ donation crisis, a stark reality painted with the hues of hope and despair. Thousands languish on waiting lists, their lives tethered to the possibility of a transplant. The demand far outstrips the supply, creating a moral pressure cooker that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. One of the most contentious: should we incentivize organ donation? And if so, how far is too far? The cornerstone of the current system in most countries is altruism, the selfless act of giving. Organ donation is presented as a final act of kindness, a way to leave a lasting legacy. However, the persistent shortage suggests that altruism alone isn't enough to bridge the gap. This is where the controversial idea of incentivizing donation enters the picture. The most debated incentive is financial compensation. The concept involves offering monetary payments to living donors or to the families of deceased donors. Proponents argue that financial incentives could dramatically increase the number of available organs, saving countless lives. Imagine a family struggling with crippling debt. The decision to donate a deceased loved one's organs could alleviate their financial burden, transforming tragedy into a source of relief, while simultaneously providing life-saving organs. Economically, this can be framed as a market failure. The demand for organs is high, the supply is low, and price signals are absent. Introducing a price, a financial incentive, could theoretically correct this imbalance. However, the ethical objections are profound. Critics argue that commodifying human organs reduces them to mere commodities, cheapening the value of life itself. They raise concerns about exploitation, particularly of vulnerable populations who might be coerced into donation due to their financial circumstances. Could the poor be pressured into selling their organs, or those of their deceased loved ones, simply to survive? Would a market for organs exacerbate existing inequalities, creating a system where the wealthy have priority access? Furthermore, concerns exist about the potential for a black market to flourish, fueled by illegal organ trafficking. If legitimate financial incentives are in place, the line between legal and illegal activity could become blurred, making it more difficult to regulate and control the organ trade. The inherent risks of surgery for living donors are also amplified. While these risks are currently undertaken out of altruism, the introduction of financial incentives might lead individuals to downplay or conceal health issues to qualify for donation, potentially jeopardizing their own well-being. Other, less controversial, incentives have been proposed. These include providing funeral expense assistance to donor families, offering tax breaks, or prioritizing donor families on the transplant waiting list should they ever need an organ themselves. These measures aim to recognize and reward the act of donation without directly putting a price on human organs. The impact of financial incentives is difficult to predict with certainty. Economic models suggest that it would likely increase the supply of organs, but the social and ethical consequences are far less clear. Some research indicates that financial incentives might actually decrease altruistic donations, as people might feel that their act of kindness is being tainted by monetary considerations. This is related to psychological reactance, where people resist being told what to do, especially when it involves a decision perceived as intrinsically moral. Ultimately, the debate over incentivizing organ donation highlights the complex interplay between ethics, economics, and human psychology. There is no easy answer, and any solution must carefully balance the potential benefits of increased organ supply with the profound ethical concerns of commodification and exploitation. It requires ongoing dialogue, rigorous research, and a commitment to ensuring that any system implemented protects the vulnerable and upholds the dignity of human life. The search for a solution is a moral tightrope walk, demanding careful consideration of the potential consequences for individuals, communities, and society as a whole. The resource allocation dilemma in healthcare is a stark and brutal ethical tightrope walk. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that resources, be it ventilators during a pandemic, organ transplants, or specialized treatment, are finite. And because of this scarcity, we are sometimes compelled to make agonizing decisions about who receives potentially life-saving care and, implicitly, who does not. This isn't a theoretical exercise. It's a daily occurrence, playing out in hospitals and healthcare systems worldwide. The core of the dilemma revolves around the competing and often irreconcilable principles of justice, beneficence, doing good, and non-maleficence, avoiding harm. Ideally, healthcare should be distributed equally, offering everyone the best possible chance at recovery and well-being. But when demand outstrips supply, this ideal crumbles. We're then left grappling with how to fairly and ethically allocate resources, often falling back on controversial criteria. One common and deeply problematic criterion is age. Prioritizing younger patients over older ones, based on the assumption of a longer potential lifespan, is known as ageism. While seemingly pragmatic, maximizing the overall years of life saved, it discounts the inherent value of every individual life, regardless of age. It raises the disturbing prospect of devaluing the experiences, contributions, and inherent worth of older individuals, potentially leading to discriminatory practices. Imagine a scenario where a young adult and an elderly person both require a liver transplant, but only one is available. An age-based system might automatically favor the younger patient, even if the elderly patient is otherwise healthier and has a higher chance of successful recovery. Another criterion is potential lifespan, which attempts to move beyond simple ageism by considering an individual's overall health and prognosis. This seems more nuanced, but still presents significant challenges. How accurately can we predict lifespan? What factors should be considered? Pre-existing conditions, lifestyle choices, genetic predispositions. Furthermore, using potential lifespan as the sole determinant can disadvantage individuals with disabilities or chronic illnesses, even if they have a reasonable chance of living a fulfilling life with treatment. The subjective nature of assessing potential opens the door to bias and discrimination. Finally, the notion of prioritizing treatment based on social contribution is perhaps the most ethically fraught. This criterion suggests that individuals deemed more valuable to society, perhaps through their profession, community involvement, or economic productivity, should be given preferential access to scarce resources. This opens a Pandora's box of value judgments. Who decides what constitutes a valuable contribution? How do we compare the contributions of a surgeon to those of a stay-at-home parent? This approach risks creating a hierarchical system where some lives are considered more worthy than others, fundamentally undermining the principle of equal human dignity. The implications for marginalized communities and individuals who may not fit neatly into conventional definitions of social contribution are deeply concerning. The impact of these allocation decisions is profound, not only on the individuals directly affected, but also on their families, healthcare professionals, and society as a whole. These choices can trigger immense guilt, moral distress, and erosion of trust in the healthcare system. Moreover, the potential for bias and discrimination inherent in these criteria can exacerbate existing inequalities and further marginalize vulnerable populations. Ultimately, the resource allocation dilemma underscores the critical need for transparent, ethical frameworks, robust public discourse, and a commitment to exploring innovative solutions to mitigate scarcity and ensure equitable access to healthcare for all. The climate change dilemma, viewed through the lens of intergenerational ethics, presents a profound and agonizing moral quandary. At its heart lies the struggle to reconcile the immediate economic demands of the present with the long-term environmental requirements of generations yet to come. It is a battle fought not on physical terrain, but within the complex architecture of our value systems. The core of this dilemma resides in the temporal asymmetry of the costs and benefits associated with climate action. The benefits of mitigating climate change, a stable global climate, preserved ecosystems, reduced frequency of extreme weather events, are largely reaped by future generations. Conversely, the costs of mitigation, investments in renewable energy, carbon taxes, shifts in industrial practices, are borne primarily by the current generation. This creates a situation where present economic gains are often achieved at the expense of future environmental well-being, and vice versa. Consider a developing nation striving to lift its population out of poverty. Reliance on cheap, readily available fossil fuels may seem like the most economically viable path, fueling industrial growth and creating jobs. However, this choice contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, accelerating climate change, and potentially undermining the long-term sustainability of the nation's development. Future generations will inherit a degraded environment, facing increased risks of drought, flooding, and displacement, negating the economic progress made by their ancestors. This inherent tension raises fundamental ethical questions. Do we have a moral obligation to consider the interests of people who do not yet exist? If so, how do we weigh their needs against our own? How do we fairly distribute the burden of climate action across generations, when the future's capacity to influence the present is essentially zero? One influential concept is that of discounting the future. Economic models often discount future benefits, assigning them a lower value than present ones. This practice is rooted in the idea that people generally prefer to receive benefits sooner rather than later, and that investments made today will yield greater returns in the future, making future benefits less valuable. However, applying this principle to climate change becomes ethically problematic. Discounting the future environmental benefits of climate action can justify an action, effectively prioritizing immediate economic gains at the expense of long-term ecological stability and the well-being of future generations. It's essentially saying we value the present economic gain of X more than the future generation's environmental loss of 10X. Another layer of complexity stems from uncertainty. The precise impacts of climate change are difficult to predict with certainty, particularly on a regional scale. This uncertainty can be used as a justification for inaction, with some arguing that the costs of mitigation are too high given the uncertain nature of the benefits. However, ethical considerations suggest that we should adopt a precautionary principle, taking action to prevent potential harm even in the absence of complete certainty. Waiting for conclusive proof of catastrophic climate change may be too late, as the inertia of the climate system means that even drastic emissions reductions may take decades to fully manifest their effects. Ultimately, resolving the climate change dilemma requires a shift in our ethical perspective. We need to move beyond a purely anthropocentric worldview, which prioritizes human interests above all else, and embrace a more ecocentric perspective, recognizing the intrinsic value of the natural world and our responsibility to protect it for future generations. This means incorporating the interests of future generations into our decision-making processes, valuing long-term sustainability over short-term economic gains, and being willing to make sacrifices today to secure a better future for all. This might involve more sustainable consumption habits, a willingness to support policies aimed at reducing emissions, and advocating for a more just and equitable distribution of the burdens and benefits of climate action. It's a complex balancing act, demanding foresight, empathy, and a commitment to intergenerational justice. The genetic engineering dilemma. We stand at the precipice of rewriting the very code of life. Modifying the human genome, once the stuff of science fiction, is rapidly becoming a tangible reality. At its heart, this dilemma explores the profound ethical implications of altering our genes, not just to prevent disease, but potentially to enhance human capabilities beyond what nature intended. The core concept revolves around the ability to precisely edit DNA, the instruction manual for our bodies. Technologies like CRISPR-Cas9 have revolutionized this field, offering a relatively simple and efficient way to target specific genes, cut them out, and potentially replace them with modified versions. The implications are staggering. Imagine eradicating inherited diseases like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, or sickle cell anemia before a child is even born. This is germline editing, alterations made to sperm, eggs, or embryos that are then passed down to future generations. The allure is undeniable. We are inherently programmed to seek health and well-being, to alleviate suffering. Germline editing offers the tantalizing prospect of eliminating devastating illnesses and preventing untold pain. However, the ethical tightrope we walk is frayed and treacherous. One major concern is unintended consequences. The human genome is a complex and interconnected system. Altering a single gene could have unforeseen effects on other genes or biological processes. What if, in our attempt to eradicate a disease, we inadvertently introduce new health problems, perhaps even ones that don't manifest for decades? The long-term effects of germline editing are largely unknown, making it a gamble with potentially devastating stakes. Beyond the risk of unintended biological consequences lies the specter of enhancement. If we can edit genes to prevent disease, why not edit them to enhance intelligence, athletic ability, or even aesthetic features? This opens a Pandora's box of ethical questions about fairness, equality, and what it truly means to be human. Would such enhancements be available only to the wealthy, creating a genetic divide between the enhanced and the unenhanced? Would it exacerbate existing social inequalities and create a new form of discrimination based on genetic makeup? Furthermore, the very definition of enhancement is subjective and culturally influenced. What one society deems desirable, another might find objectionable. The potential for misuse and the imposition of societal values on future generations is a real and pressing concern. Consider the hypothetical scenario of editing genes to increase muscle mass and bone density in soldiers. While this might seem like a beneficial military advantage, it also raises questions about the ethics of creating genetically enhanced killing machines. Or imagine editing genes to suppress empathy or increase obedience, traits that could be exploited for nefarious purposes. The debate also extends to the concept of eugenics, a discredited and ethically abhorrent philosophy that advocated for selective breeding to improve the human race. While modern genetic engineering is not necessarily rooted in eugenic ideology, the potential for it to be used for similar purposes cannot be ignored. The line between preventing disease and designing better humans is thin and easily blurred. Ultimately, the genetic engineering dilemma forces us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, our responsibilities to future generations, and the limits of scientific intervention. It demands a careful and nuanced approach, one that balances the potential benefits with the inherent risks and ethical challenges. The future of humanity may well depend on the choices we make today. Imagine building a supposedly objective judge, a digital oracle dispensing justice based solely on data. This is the promise of AI in many domains, from loan applications to criminal justice. But what happens when that judge is subtly, unconsciously prejudiced? This is the AI ethics dilemma of algorithmic bias, and it's far more insidious than a simple programming error. Algorithmic bias arises because AI, particularly machine learning systems, learns from data. If that data reflects existing societal biases, historical inequalities, prejudiced attitudes, or skewed representation, the AI will inevitably absorb and amplify those biases. It's like teaching a child using only biased textbooks. Their understanding of the world will be inherently flawed. The mechanisms through which bias creeps and are multifaceted. Firstly, there's bias training data. Consider a facial recognition system trained primarily on images of white men. It will likely perform exceptionally well on that demographic, but struggle significantly, perhaps even dangerously, with accurately identifying individuals of other ethnicities or genders. This isn't malice. It's a statistical consequence. The AI is simply better at recognizing what it has seen more often. Secondly, bias feature selection plays a crucial role. In predictive policing algorithms, if historical arrest data, which may disproportionately target certain neighborhoods due to over-policing, is used as a primary feature, the algorithm will perpetuate a feedback loop, recommending increased police presence in those same areas, further skewing arrest data and solidifying the bias. The AI identifies correlations, but not necessarily causation, and amplifies existing inequalities. Thirdly, biased algorithm design itself can contribute. The very structure of the algorithm, the weighting of different factors, and the choices made by the developers can unconsciously encode their own biases into the system. Even seemingly neutral objectives, like maximizing efficiency or accuracy, can have discriminatory consequences if not carefully considered in the context of existing social inequalities. Consider a hypothetical AI used for screening job applications. If the AI is trained on data that shows historically men have been more successful in certain roles, it might penalize applications from women, even if they possess equivalent qualifications. This perpetuates gender inequality, subtly reinforcing the status quo under the guise of objective assessment. The impact of algorithmic bias is far-reaching and potentially devastating. It can lead to unfair loan denials, biased hiring practices, discriminatory pricing, and even wrongful accusations in the criminal justice system. It can disproportionately affect marginalized communities, reinforcing systemic inequalities and eroding trust in technology. What's particularly concerning is that these biases are often opaque, hidden within the complex workings of the AI, making them difficult to detect and challenge. Mitigating algorithmic bias is a complex and ongoing challenge. It requires a multi-pronged approach, meticulous data auditing to identify and correct biases in training data, careful feature selection with an awareness of potential discriminatory impacts, and robust testing to evaluate the performance of the AI across different demographic groups. Explainable AI, XAI, techniques are also crucial, allowing us to understand how the AI arrives at its decisions and identify potential sources of bias. Furthermore, diverse teams of developers are essential to ensure a broader range of perspectives are considered during the design and development process. Critically, continuous monitoring and evaluation are needed to detect and address biases that may emerge over time as the AI interacts with the real world. The fight against algorithmic bias is not simply a technical problem. It's a moral imperative. It demands constant vigilance, critical self-reflection, and a commitment to fairness and equity in the age of artificial intelligence. The future we build depends on it. The data privacy dilemma. At its core, it's the agonizing tug-of-war between the perceived need for security, often national security, but also corporate security and even personal safety, and the fundamental right to individual privacy. In the digital age, this conflict has become exponentially more complex and pervasive. We're constantly generating data. Every search, every purchase, every social media post, every location ping from our smartphones, creating a vast and intricate digital footprint. This data holds immense value, both for legitimate purposes like improving services and preventing crime, but also for potential misuse and exploitation. The allure of surveillance stems from the promise of predictive capabilities. By analyzing large data sets, governments and corporations alike believe they can identify potential threats, anticipate consumer behavior, and tailor their actions accordingly. Imagine a city using CCTV footage and AI algorithms to identify individuals exhibiting pre-criminal behavior, a concept chillingly explored in science fiction, but increasingly within the realm of possibility. Or consider a company analyzing your browsing history to predict your next purchase, subtly nudging you towards a specific product. The mechanisms of data collection are diverse and often obscured. From cookies tracking your website visits to sophisticated data mining algorithms combing through publicly available information, our online activities are constantly monitored and analyzed. The Internet of Things, with its array of interconnected devices, further expands the scope of surveillance, turning everyday objects into potential sources of data. Even seemingly innocuous features, like voice assistants, collect and store vast amounts of personal information. The impact on individual privacy rights is profound. Unfettered surveillance can lead to a chilling effect on free speech and expression. Knowing that your online activities are being monitored can make you hesitant to express controversial opinions or engage in activities that might attract unwanted attention. It can also lead to discrimination, as algorithms can perpetuate and amplify existing biases, unfairly targeting certain groups or individuals. Consider the hypothetical case of a health insurance company using wearable fitness tracker data to deny coverage to individuals deemed to be at high risk. Or imagine a potential employer using social media activity to assess a candidate's suitability for a job, overlooking their qualifications based on perceived personality flaws or political affiliations. These scenarios highlight the potential for data to be used to unfairly judge and discriminate against individuals. The ethical considerations are multifaceted. Is it justifiable to sacrifice individual privacy for the sake of collective security? Where do we draw the line between legitimate data collection and unwarranted intrusion? How can we ensure transparency and accountability in the use of surveillance technologies? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. The challenge lies in finding a balance. We need to develop legal frameworks and ethical guidelines that protect individual privacy rights while allowing for the responsible use of data for legitimate purposes. This requires a multi-pronged approach, including stronger data protection laws, greater transparency in data collection practices, and increased public awareness of the risks and benefits of surveillance technologies. We also need to foster a culture of data minimization, where only the necessary data is collected and retained, and where individuals have greater control over their personal information. The data privacy dilemma demands constant vigilance and a commitment to safeguarding the fundamental rights of individuals in the digital age. The pursuit of scientific truth, particularly in fields like psychology and medicine, often bumps against a fundamental ethical principle: informed consent. We believe individuals have the right to know what they're signing up for, to understand the potential risks and benefits of participating in research. But what happens when full disclosure itself threatens to invalidate the very data you're trying to collect? This is the crux of the informed consent dilemma in research. Imagine you're studying the placebo effect. You want to understand how a sugar pill can alleviate pain simply because the patient believes it's a powerful painkiller. Telling participants outright that they might receive a placebo completely destroys the magic. The expectation of receiving a real drug is what triggers the physiological and psychological mechanisms that drive the placebo response. Informed consent, in its purest form, would render your research question unanswerable. This isn't just about tricking people. It's about isolating and understanding genuine psychological phenomena. Think about research on implicit bias. If you explicitly inform participants that you're measuring their unconscious prejudices related to race or gender, they might consciously try to suppress or alter their responses, skewing the results. Their awareness of the study's purpose introduces a confounding variable, an artificial influence that masks the true underlying attitudes. The mechanism at play is often reactivity, the tendency for people to behave differently when they know they are being observed or evaluated. In the context of research, this reactivity can manifest as demand characteristics, subtle cues in the experimental setting that unintentionally communicate to participants how they are expected to behave. Full disclosure can amplify these demand characteristics, turning a genuine exploration into a performance. The impact of this dilemma is far-reaching. Withholding information, even temporarily, raises serious ethical questions about autonomy and deception. Are we justified in deceiving participants, even with the promise of future debriefing, for the greater good of scientific progress? What safeguards need to be in place to protect participants from potential harm, both physical and psychological? Consider a hypothetical study on conformity. Researchers might tell participants they are assessing visual perception, when in reality, they are measuring how easily individuals conform to incorrect answers given by a group of Confederates, researchers posing as participants. Debriefing is crucial here, not only to reveal the true purpose of the study, but also to address any feelings of discomfort or manipulation the participants might experience. The debriefing must clearly explain the rationale for deception, the value of the research, and offer resources for further understanding and support. Navigating this dilemma requires a careful balancing act. Researchers must meticulously weigh the potential benefits of the research against the ethical costs of deception. Institutional review boards, IRBs, play a vital role in this process, scrutinizing research protocols to ensure that deception is minimized